April 8, 2025. Grisly attacks prison transport bus. 1 guard killed, 6 inmates injured. April 8, 2025. Grisly attacks. Prison transport bus. 1 guard killed, 6 inmates injured. The morning air in southwestern Montana carried the crisp bite of early spring, with patches of snow still clinging to the shadowed ravines that carve through the Bitterroot Mountains. Highway 93 stretched like a black ribbon through the wilderness, connecting the small communities scattered across this vast expanse of untamed country. For most travelers, it was simply another scenic route through Big Sky country. For the Montana Department of Corrections, it was a necessary corridor that transported some of the state's most dangerous inmates between facilities. Correctional Officer Martin Hayes had made this run 17 times in his 8-year career, always maintaining the same level of professional vigilance that had earned him commendations from his supervisors. At 42, Martin stood 6 feet tall with the lean build of a former military man, his weathered face bearing the lines of someone who had spent years watching and waiting. His steel-grey eyes missed nothing, and his colleagues respected his unwavering attention to detail. Martin had served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a military police officer before returning to his home state of Montana, where he met his wife Sarah at a church social in Missoula. They had been married for 15 years and had 2 children, Emma, 13, and Michael, 11. Sarah often worried about Martin's work, knowing that each transport carried inherent risks, but Martin's calm demeanor and professional competence had always reassured her that he could handle whatever situation might arise. His partner for this transport was Officer Rebecca Becca Torino, a 34-year-old corrections veteran with 9 years of experience in the system. Becca had grown up in Helena, the daughter of a long-line family of law enforcement officers. Her father had been a sheriff's deputy for 30 years, and her older brother currently served as a detective with the Montana Highway Patrol. Standing 5'8" with dark hair pulled back in regulation style, Becca possessed the kind of quiet intensity that commanded respect from inmates without resorting to intimidation. She had earned her reputation through fair but firm handling of even the most difficult prisoners, never allowing her guard to drop, but also never treating inmates with unnecessary harshness. Becca lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Helena with her German Shepherd Rex, whom she had rescued from the local animal shelter 3 years earlier. She'd been in a relationship with a fellow corrections officer, but the demands of their schedules and the stress of their work had eventually taken its toll, leaving her single but focused on her career. The Montana Department of Corrections transport bus they operated was a reinforced Ford chassis fitted with specialized security modifications. The vehicle measured 35 feet in length and featured steel mesh barriers separating the driver and passenger compartments from the prisoner seating area. The prisoner section contained 16 seats, each equipped with anchor points for leg shackles and waist chains. The seats were arranged in pairs along both sides of the aisle, with a narrow walkway down the center. Heavy-duty steel screens covered the windows, and a single reinforced door provided access to the prisoner compartment from the outside. The bus had been manufactured by Carpenter Bus Sales in 2019 and had logged over 150,000 miles in its service to the state correction system. The morning's manifest listed 6 inmates scheduled for transport from the Granite County Detention Center to the Montana State Prison in Deer Lodge, with an additional pickup planned at the Powell County Detention Center. Each prisoner represented a different facet of Montana's criminal justice system, their individual stories creating a complex tapestry of circumstances that had led them to this moment. Inmate Marcus David Thompson, prisoner number 147832, occupied seat 3A on the right side of the bus. At 28 years old, Marcus stood 6'2" with a muscular frame built through years of manual labor and prison workouts. His dark skin bore numerous tattoos that told the story of his life on the streets of Billings, where he had grown up in the foster care system after his mother died of a heroin overdose when he was 7. Marcus had been convicted of armed robbery in the first degree after holding up 3 convenience stores over a 2-week period in 2023. His lawyer had argued that Marcus was struggling with addiction and had committed the crimes to support his habit, but the prosecution emphasized his use of a loaded .38 caliber revolver during each robbery, resulting in a sentence of 12 years with the possibility of parole after 8. Despite his criminal record, Marcus had shown signs of rehabilitation during his incarceration, earning his GED and participating in the prison's substance abuse program. He maintained correspondence with his younger sister Angela, who lived in Denver and worked as a nurse's aide, and had expressed hope of relocating to Colorado upon his eventual release. In Seat 4, B sat Thomas Riley Kowalski, prisoner number 159047, a 45-year-old man whose life had taken a devastating turn following a drunk driving incident that claimed the lives of 2 teenagers. Thomas had been a successful insurance adjuster in Missoula, married to his high school sweetheart Linda, and father to 3 children. His fall from grace began with the gradual increase of his alcohol consumption following the death of his own father from cancer, a process that Linda and the children watched with growing concern. On the night of September 15, 2023, Thomas had consumed an estimated 12 beers at a local sports bar before attempting to drive home. His blood alcohol content measured .19 when tested 3 hours after the collision that killed 17-year-old Jessica Martinez and 18-year-old Kevin Chen, both recent graduates of Sentinel High School who had been returning from a movie. Thomas had no memory of the crash itself, awakening in the hospital to learn that his actions had destroyed 2 families and irrevocably changed his own. He pleaded guilty to 2 counts of vehicular homicide while intoxicated and received a sentence of 15 years. His wife had filed for divorce 6 months after his conviction, and his children had expressed no desire for contact. Thomas spent his days in a fog of guilt and self-recrimination, participating minimally in prison programs and maintaining correspondence only with his elderly mother, who visited him monthly despite her own failing health. Prisoner number 142156, Jennifer Lynn Vasquez, 26 years old, sat in Seat 5A, her small frame dwarfed by the heavy restraints that secured her to the transport bench. Jennifer's story began in the methamphetamine epidemic that had ravaged rural Montana communities, leaving behind a trail of broken families and destroyed lives. She had been raised by her grandmother in a small trailer outside of Kalispell after her parents were both incarcerated on drug-related charges when she was 9 years old. Despite her grandmother's efforts to provide stability, Jennifer began experimenting with methamphetamines at age 15, quickly developing an addiction that would dominate the next decade of her life. Her criminal record included numerous arrests for possession, theft, and prostitution, each conviction representing another step deeper into the cycle of addiction and incarceration. Her current sentence stemmed from her participation in a home invasion robbery, where she and 2 male accomplices had targeted what they believed to be a drug dealer's residence. The invasion went tragically wrong when the occupant, 73-year-old retired teacher Harold Brennan, suffered a fatal heart attack during the incident. Jennifer pleaded guilty to felony murder and received a sentence of 25 years. During her incarceration, she had successfully completed a 90-day detoxification program and had been clean from methamphetamines for 8 months, the longest period of sobriety since her adolescence. She maintained hope of eventually reuniting with her 4-year-old daughter Sophia. who was being raised by Jennifer's cousin in Oregon. The fourth inmate, Robert James Bobby Sullivan, prisoner number 153489, age 32, had been convicted of aggravated assault following a bar fight that left another man permanently disabled. Bobby sat in seat 6B, his red hair cropped short and his arms covered with Celtic-themed tattoos that reflected his Irish heritage and his involvement with various white supremacist groups during his 20s. Standing 6 feet tall with a stocky build, Bobby had worked as a construction laborer and mechanic before his incarceration. Skills that he had hoped would provide him with legitimate employment opportunities. The assault conviction arose from an incident at Mickey's Tavern in Great Falls, where Bobby had been drinking with friends while watching a college football game. A dispute over the game had escalated into a physical confrontation when Bobby struck another patron, Dale Morrison, with a pool cue, causing traumatic brain injury that left Morrison partially paralyzed and unable to speak clearly. Security footage from the bar clearly showed Bobby initiating the violence, and multiple witnesses testified to his history of aggressive behavior when intoxicated. He received a sentence of 10 years with the possibility of parole after 7. During his incarceration, Bobby had participated in anger management classes and had reportedly distanced himself from his previous associations with extremist groups. His mother, Patricia Sullivan, continued to visit him regularly and had expressed hope that her son could overcome his problems with alcohol and violence. In seat 7A sat the oldest inmate on the transport, 54-year-old William Ernest Carver, prisoner number 138729, whose conviction for child sexual assault had earned him a 20-year sentence and the perpetual hostility of his fellow inmates. William had been a high school mathematics teacher in Bozeman for 18 years, earning recognition as Teacher of the Year twice and maintaining what appeared to be an exemplary record of service to his community. Behind this facade, however, William had been systematically abusing his position to exploit vulnerable students, particularly those from troubled homes who stayed after school for tutoring sessions. His crimes came to light when 16-year-old student Amanda Foster finally found the courage to report his behavior to a school counselor, triggering an investigation that ultimately revealed a pattern of abuse spanning several years and involving 5 different victims. The community's shock and outrage over William's betrayal of trust had been profound, with parents questioning how such behavior could have gone undetected for so long. During his trial, William's defense attorney had argued for mental health treatment rather than incarceration, but the prosecution's evidence of deliberate predatory behavior and the emotional testimony from his victims had resulted in the maximum sentence. William had been transferred between facilities multiple times due to threats from other inmates, and his presence in the general population required constant vigilance from correctional staff. The final inmate, Carl Anthony Rodriguez, prisoner number 161203, 23 years old, occupied seat 8B at the rear of the transport compartment. Carl had been convicted of burglary in the 2nd degree following his arrest during a break-in at a residential neighborhood in Billings. Unlike some of his fellow inmates whose crimes reflected addiction or psychological problems, Carl's criminal behavior appeared to be primarily motivated by opportunism and a general disregard for other people's property rights. He had been raised in a stable middle-class family in Billings, where his father worked as a supervisor at a local refinery, and his mother managed a real estate office. Despite his parents' efforts to provide guidance and support, Carl had begun stealing from neighbors and classmates during his teenage years, gradually escalating to more serious property crimes as he reached adulthood. His current conviction resulted from his arrest while attempting to steal electronics from a home whose occupants were attending a funeral. A neighbor's security camera had captured Carl breaking a window to gain entry, and his fingerprints were found throughout the residence. He received a sentence of 5 years with the possibility of parole after 3. Carl's parents had initially supported him through his legal troubles, but their relationship had become strained by his continued refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. He spent much of his time in custody, reading legal materials and filing appeals, convinced that his conviction was based on insufficient evidence despite the overwhelming proof of his guilt. The transport route for April 8th had been carefully planned by the Montana Department of Corrections Transportation Division, taking into account security considerations, timing requirements, and the logistical challenges of moving inmates between facilities across the state's vast distances. The journey would begin at the Granite County Detention Center in Phillipsburg, where all 6 inmates had been assembled for processing and loading. From there, the route would proceed north on Highway 1 to Interstate 90, then west to Butte, before turning north on Highway 15 toward Helena and ultimately Deer Lodge. The total distance measured approximately 180 miles, with an estimated travel time of 4 hours, including the planned stops for security checks and prisoner comfort requirements. Highway 93, which formed a crucial segment of their planned route, cut through some of Montana's most pristine wilderness areas, including sections of the Bitterroot National Forest and the Lolo National Forest. This region supported one of North America's most robust grizzly bear populations, with wildlife biologists estimating that over 300 individual bears inhabited the greater Bitterroot ecosystem. Spring represented a particularly active period for grizzly bears as they emerged from hibernation with depleted fat reserves and an urgent need to locate food sources. Male grizzly bears, in particular, ranged widely during this season, often covering territories of several hundred square miles in their search for carrion, spawning fish, and other nutrition sources necessary to rebuild their strength after months of winter dormancy. The specific bear that would forever change the lives of everyone aboard the transport bus had been tracked intermittently by Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks biologists for the past 3 years. Designated as Bear G247, in their research database, this particular grizzly was an adult male estimated to be 12 years old and weighing approximately 650 pounds. Bears of this size and age represented the apex predators of their ecosystem, possessing the strength to move boulders weighing several hundred pounds and the speed to overtake a horse in short-distance sprints. Bear number G247 had been fitted with a GPS tracking collar in 2022, following several encounters with humans near camping areas. But the collar had malfunctioned 6 months earlier, leaving wildlife officials without current information about his location and behavior patterns. Dr. Sarah Chen, a wildlife biologist with 15 years of experience studying grizzly bear behavior, had been part of the team that initially tagged bear number G247. In her research notes, she had described him as an unusually large specimen with distinctive facial scarring that suggested previous territorial conflicts with other male bears. Her observations indicated that this particular bear displayed more aggressive behavior toward humans than was typical for the species, possibly the result of negative conditioning experiences or territorial stress related to habitat encroachment. Dr. Chen had recommended enhanced monitoring protocols for Bear G247, but budget constraints and personnel limitations had prevented the implementation of her suggested surveillance program. The morning of April 8th dawned clear and crisp, with temperatures hovering near 35 degrees Fahrenheit and scattered clouds drifting across an azure sky. A light breeze from the northwest carried the scent of pine needles and melting snow, creating the kind of pristine mountain atmosphere that attracted thousands of tourists to Montana each year. For the officers and inmates beginning their journey that day, however, the natural beauty surrounding them served merely as a backdrop to the routine procedures and security protocols that governed their transport mission. Martin Hayes arrived at the Granite County Detention Center at 5:30 a.m., 90 minutes before the scheduled departure time. His routine never varied. First, a comprehensive inspection of the transport vehicle, checking tire pressure, fluid levels, emergency equipment, and communication systems. Martin believed that mechanical failures represented one of the most significant risks during prisoner transport, potentially creating security vulnerabilities that could be exploited by inmates seeking to escape. He methodically tested the radio equipment, verified that the GPS tracking system was functioning properly, and confirmed that all prisoner restraint anchor points were secure and undamaged. The vehicle's emergency medical kit received particular attention, as Martin had completed advanced first aid training and understood that medical emergencies could occur suddenly during transport, particularly with inmates who might have underlying health conditions or medication requirements. Becca Torino arrived 15 minutes later, carrying her equipment bag and a thermos of coffee that she had prepared at home. Her pre-transport routine focused primarily on reviewing the prisoner files and understanding any special security considerations or medical requirements for each inmate. She spread the manila folders across the hood of a patrol car parked nearby, studying the photographs, conviction records, and behavioral assessments that would inform her handling of each prisoner during the transport. Becca had learned through experience that successful prisoner transport depended largely on understanding the personalities and motivations of the individuals in custody, allowing officers to anticipate potential problems before they developed into serious security threats. The Granite County Detention Center itself was a modern facility constructed in 2015 to serve the sparsely populated counties of southwestern Montana. Built to house up to 120 inmates, the facility featured state-of-the-art security systems and specialized housing units for different categories of prisoners. The transport staging area included a sally port designed to allow secure loading of inmates without exposing them to the general public or creating opportunities for escape attempts. Thick concrete walls and redundant security barriers ensured that even if inmates managed to break free from their restraints during the loading process, they would remain contained within the facility perimeter. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell, the 48-year-old commander of the Montana Department of Corrections Transportation Division, had arrived early that morning to personally oversee the transport operation. Mitchell's 22 years of military service, including deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan, had provided him with extensive experience in moving personnel through potentially dangerous territory. He understood that prisoner transport operations shared many similarities with military convoy security, requiring careful planning, constant vigilance, and the ability to respond quickly to unexpected threats. Mitchell had implemented numerous improvements to Montana's prisoner transport protocols during his 3 years with the Corrections Department, including enhanced officer training programs, upgraded vehicle security features, and improved coordination with local law enforcement agencies along transport routes. At 6:45 a.m., the prisoner loading process began with the systematic retrieval of each inmate from their individual holding cells. Montana Department of Corrections protocol required that inmates be dressed in bright orange jumpsuits with "Prisoner Transport" printed in large black letters across the back, ensuring immediate identification by law enforcement personnel or civilian witnesses in the event of an escape attempt. Each prisoner was fitted with a standard set of restraints, including leg shackles, waist chain, and handcuffs, all connected by a security chain that severely limited mobility while still allowing the inmate to walk in shuffling steps. Marcus Thompson was the first inmate loaded onto the transport bus, his imposing physical presence requiring 2 officers to escort him from the detention center to his assigned seat. Despite his intimidating appearance, Marcus cooperated fully with the loading procedures, exchanging brief pleasantries with Officer Hayes and thanking him for treating him with respect. Marcus had developed a reputation among the corrections staff as a model prisoner who followed rules and rarely caused problems, a dramatic change from his earlier years when his anger and frustration had frequently resulted in disciplinary actions. His participation in educational and rehabilitation programs had earned him the respect of both inmates and staff, and several officers had written letters supporting his parole application scheduled for review in 2027. Thomas Kowalski presented a stark contrast to Marcus as he shuffled toward the transport bus with his head down and his shoulders slumped in a posture of defeat. The guilt and remorse that had consumed him since his conviction were evident in every aspect of his demeanor, from his reluctance to make eye contact with the officers to his whispered apologies when his leg shackles caused him to stumble during the boarding process. Becca Torino had reviewed his psychological evaluations and understood that Thomas represented a minimal security risk due to his complete acceptance of responsibility for his crimes and his genuine remorse for the deaths he had caused. However, she also recognized that his severe depression and suicidal ideation required careful monitoring throughout the transport to ensure that he did not attempt self-harm. Jennifer Vasquez's small stature made her appear almost childlike as she was escorted to the transport bus, her drug-ravaged body showing the physical toll of years of methamphetamine addiction. At 97 pounds, she was the smallest inmate on the transport, but her history of unpredictable behavior related to drug withdrawal had earned her a classification requiring additional security precautions. Jennifer had been clean from methamphetamines for 8 months, but corrections staff remained concerned about the possibility of violent outbursts triggered by stress or anxiety. During her escort to the bus, Jennifer maintained a respectful attitude toward the officers while repeatedly asking about the status of her daughter Sophia, whom she had not seen since her incarceration began. Bobby Sullivan's boarding process proceeded without incident, though both officers remained alert to the potential for problems based on his history of violence and his documented association with extremist groups. Bobby had been involved in 3 physical altercations with other inmates during his incarceration, resulting in extended periods of solitary confinement and the loss of various privileges. However, his recent participation in anger management programs and his apparent rejection of his previous extremist beliefs had led to a gradual improvement in his institutional behavior. As he settled into his assigned seat, Bobby nodded respectfully to both officers and expressed appreciation for their professionalism, a marked change from his earlier pattern of antagonistic behavior toward authority figures. The loading of William Carver required special precautions due to the nature of his crimes and the threats he had received from other inmates. Child sex offenders occupied the lowest position in the prison hierarchy, subjected to constant harassment and physical violence from other prisoners who viewed their crimes as particularly heinous. William had been attacked twice during his incarceration, suffering a broken nose and several broken ribs in incidents that required extended medical treatment. As he boarded the transport bus, William avoided eye contact with his fellow inmates and positioned himself as far as possible from the others, clearly understanding that his safety depended on maintaining a low profile throughout the journey. Carl Rodriguez was the final inmate to board the transport, his cocky demeanor and casual attitude contrasting sharply with the somber mood displayed by most of his fellow prisoners. Carl had consistently maintained his innocence despite overwhelming evidence of his guilt, and his interactions with corrections staff were characterized by sarcasm and barely concealed contempt for the criminal justice system. As he settled into the rear seat of the bus, Carl made several comments about his pending appeal and his confidence that his conviction would be overturned, statements that drew eye rolls from both officers and his fellow inmates. At 7:15 a.m., Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell conducted a final security briefing with the transport officers, reviewing the planned route, communication protocols, and emergency procedures. The transport was equipped with multiple communication systems, including traditional radio equipment, cellular phones, and a satellite-based emergency beacon that could summon assistance from any location within the continental United States. Mitchell emphasized the importance of maintaining regular contact with the Corrections Department Dispatch Center and provided both officers with the contact information for law enforcement agencies along their planned route. The transport departed the Granite County Detention Center at precisely 7:30 a.m., beginning a journey that had been completed safely hundreds of times over the years. Martin Hayes navigated the vehicle carefully through the narrow streets of Phillipsburg, conscious of the need to avoid sudden stops or sharp turns that might cause injury to the shackled inmates in the rear compartment. The morning traffic was light, consisting primarily of commuters heading to work in the small businesses that formed the economic backbone of this historic mining town. As the transport bus merged onto Highway 1, heading north toward Interstate 90, the landscape began to change from the settled areas around Phillipsburg to the more remote wilderness that characterized much of southwestern Montana. Dense forests of lodgepole pine and Douglas fir lined both sides of the highway, creating a natural corridor that stretched for miles without any visible signs of human habitation. This was the domain of elk, deer, black bears, and the apex predator that would soon change everything, the grizzly bear. The first hour of the transport proceeded normally, with inmates settling into the routine of highway travel and officers maintaining their vigilance while monitoring radio communications and traffic conditions. Becca Torino conducted periodic visual checks of the inmates, ensuring that their restraints remained secure and watching for any signs of medical distress or behavioral problems. Her experience had taught her that the confined environment of a transport bus could exacerbate existing health conditions or trigger anxiety attacks in inmates who were claustrophobic or prone to panic disorders. At 8:45 a.m., the transport reached the junction with Interstate 90 near Drummond, Montana, where Martin Hayes paused briefly to check his mirrors and confirm that all vehicle systems were functioning normally. The interstate highway offered improved road conditions and higher speed limits, allowing the transport to make better time toward their destination. However, the increased speed also required greater attention to following distances and emergency stopping procedures, particularly given the weight of the armored transport bus and the potential for unpredictable behavior from other motorists who might be curious about the prison transport. Radio contact with the Corrections Department Dispatch Center remained clear and consistent as the transport proceeded west on Interstate 90 toward Butte. Dispatcher Jennifer Walsh, a 12-year veteran of the Communications Center, maintained a log of the transport's progress and coordinated with other agencies along the route to ensure that assistance would be readily available if needed. The dispatch center served as a critical link between transport officers and the broader law enforcement community, providing real-time intelligence about road conditions, weather updates, and any security concerns that might affect the safety of the operation. The landscape visible from the interstate showcased Montana's dramatic natural beauty, with snow-capped mountain peaks rising on both sides of the highway and vast expanses of wilderness stretching to the horizon. For tourists and casual travelers, this scenery represented the essence of the American West, evoking images of frontier exploration and untamed wilderness. For experienced corrections officers, however, the remote location represented a significant tactical challenge, with limited options for assistance in the event of an emergency and vast areas where an escaped prisoner could potentially disappear without a trace. At 9:30 a.m., as the transport approached the outskirts of Butte, Montana's historic copper mining center, Martin Hayes received a routine radio check from the dispatch center. Transport 7-4, this is dispatch. Please report your current location and status. Jennifer Walsh's voice crackled through the radio speaker. Dispatch, this is Transport 7-4, approaching Butte on Interstate 90, all secure. ETA Helena, approximately 11:30, Martin responded, his voice calm and professional as he maintained his focus on the highway ahead. Copy that. Transport 7-4. Weather conditions remaining favorable, no alerts along your route. Continue monitoring this frequency for updates. The exchange represented one of dozens of similar communications that occurred during every transport operation, creating a continuous link between the officers and their support network. These routine contacts served multiple purposes. They confirmed that the transport was proceeding according to schedule. They provided dispatch personnel with current location information that could be critical during an emergency response, and they offered reassurance to the officers that help was always available if needed. The city of Butte, once known as the richest hill on Earth due to its vast copper deposits, had evolved from its mining heritage into a regional center for education and government services. The transport bus navigated through the city's historic streets, passing landmarks that testified to Montana's industrial past, while highlighting the economic challenges facing many rural communities in the modern era. Several inmates gazed out the reinforced windows at the urban landscape, perhaps reflecting on their own lives and the choices that had led them to their current circumstances. Bobby Sullivan, in particular, seemed transfixed by the sight of construction workers repairing a section of roadway, their orange safety vests and hard hats reminding him of his previous life as a laborer before his problems with alcohol and violence had destroyed his career prospects. During his incarceration, Bobby had participated in vocational training programs designed to prepare inmates for employment upon their release. But he understood that his criminal record would make it difficult to find work in his previous field. The sight of men doing the kind of honest work he had once taken for granted filled him with a mixture of nostalgia and regret that he struggled to suppress. As the transport departed Butte and turned north on Highway 15 toward Helena, the terrain became increasingly mountainous and remote. This portion of the journey would take the bus through the heart of grizzly bear territory, including areas where human-bear encounters had increased significantly in recent years due to drought conditions that had reduced natural food sources. The Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department had issued several advisories warning hikers and campers about increased bear activity in the region. But these warnings were primarily directed at recreational users rather than commercial or official vehicles traveling on major highways. Bear number G247 had been moving through this area for the past week, following ancient migration patterns encoded in his genetic memory and refined through years of experience navigating the complex terrain of his territorial range. At 650 pounds, he represented the culmination of millions of years of evolutionary adaptation, possessing sensory capabilities that far exceeded those of any human and physical attributes that made him one of North America's most formidable predators. His sense of smell was approximately 100 times more sensitive than that of a human, allowing him to detect food sources from distances of several miles under favorable wind conditions. His hearing was similarly acute, capable of detecting frequencies and subtle sounds that would be completely inaudible to human ears. The previous winter had been particularly harsh in the Bitterroot ecosystem, with heavy snowfall and extended periods of cold weather that had delayed the emergence of many plant species that normally provided early spring nutrition for bears. As a result, Bear G247 and others like him were facing more severe nutritional stress than usual as they emerged from hibernation, increasing the likelihood that they would take risks to obtain food that they might normally avoid. The bear had already encountered humans twice during the past month, investigating campsites and garbage containers in search of calories to fuel his recovery from the winter's deprivation. At approximately 10:15 a.m., as the prison transport bus traveled north on Highway 15 through a particularly remote section of mountainous terrain, bear number G247 was foraging along a creek bed roughly 2 miles east of the highway. The bear had been attracted to this location by the scent of a deer carcass, the remains of an animal that had been killed by wolves several days earlier and subsequently abandoned after the pack had consumed the choicest portions. Grizzly bears were opportunistic scavengers as well as active predators, and carrion represented an important food source, particularly during the spring months when their energy requirements were highest and alternative food sources were limited. The wind patterns in the mountainous terrain created complex air currents that could carry scents across great distances, and as Bear G247 fed on the deer carcass, he detected something unusual in the air, a combination of human odors, mechanical exhaust, and other scents that suggested human activity nearby. Unlike the typical hiking or camping odors that he had learned to associate with temporary human presence, these scents carried a different character that triggered his curiosity and prompted him to investigate further. Grizzly bears are naturally curious animals, a trait that serves them well in their role as opportunistic feeders, but that can also lead them into dangerous encounters with humans. Bear number G247's previous experiences with human-provided food sources, including garbage containers and improperly stored camping supplies, had created a behavioral pattern where human scents were associated with potential food rewards rather than threats to be avoided. This conditioning process, known to wildlife biologists as food habituation, represented one of the primary factors that led to dangerous bear-human encounters throughout North America. As the transport bus continued north on Highway 15, neither Martin Hayes nor Becca Torino had any awareness of the massive predator that was beginning to move in their direction. Their attention remained focused on the inmates in their custody, the traffic conditions on the highway, and the routine security procedures that governed their operation. The radio continued to provide periodic updates from the dispatch center, and all indications suggested that the transport was proceeding according to plan without any unusual circumstances that might require additional precautions. The highway in this section cut through a narrow valley flanked by steep hillsides covered with dense forest, creating natural corridors that wildlife frequently used for movement between different areas of their territory. Montana Department of Transportation engineers had recognized this reality during the highway's construction, installing wildlife crossing structures and fencing designed to reduce vehicle-animal collisions. However, these measures were primarily intended to address the movement patterns of smaller animals, such as deer and elk, and they were not specifically designed to contain or redirect grizzly bears, whose size, strength, and intelligence allowed them to overcome many barriers that would be effective against other species. At 10:22 a.m., Bear G247 reached the edge of the forest adjacent to Highway 15, his acute senses allowing him to locate the source of the interesting scents he had detected earlier, the sight and sound of the prison transport bus. Unlike any vehicle the bear had encountered in his previous human interactions, triggered a complex behavioral response that combined curiosity, territorial assertion, and food-seeking behavior. The bus's large size and distinctive coloration may have suggested to the bear that it represented a significant potential food source, particularly given the multiple human scents emanating from the vehicle. Martin Hayes first noticed something unusual in his peripheral vision as a large, dark shape moved through the trees parallel to the highway, approximately 50 yards ahead of the bus's current position. His initial reaction was curiosity rather than alarm, as wildlife sightings were common along this route, and both black bears and grizzly bears were frequently observed by travelers during the spring and summer months. However, as the shape emerged more clearly from the tree line, Martin's training and experience immediately recognized the distinctive profile and gait of an adult grizzly bear. "Becker, we've got a bear at 2 o'clock, about 50 yards ahead," Martin said calmly, maintaining his focus on driving while indicating the location with a slight nod of his head. Becca Torino immediately turned her attention in the direction Martin had indicated, her hand instinctively moving to the radio microphone clipped to her uniform shirt. She could see the massive bear moving through the sparse vegetation at the forest's edge, its distinctive shoulder hump and dished facial profile clearly identifying it as a grizzly rather than the smaller and generally less aggressive black bears that were more common in the area. "That's a big one," Becker observed, her voice remaining calm despite the unusual nature of the sighting. "Want me to call it into Fish and Wildlife?" "Let's see what he does first," Martin replied, reducing the bus's speed slightly to give the bear more time and space to move away from the highway. "He's probably just passing through." Both officers had encountered bears during their careers, though always at distances that had allowed them to observe the animals without direct interaction. Montana corrections officers received basic training in wildlife awareness as part of their preparation for transport duties, and both Martin and Becker understood that bears typically avoided human contact unless they were defending cubs, protecting a food source, or had become habituated to human-provided food. The sight of a single adult bear near the highway, while noteworthy, did not initially suggest any immediate threat to their security or safety. In the prisoner compartment, several inmates had also noticed the bear, with Marcus Thompson being the first to comment on the sighting. "Check out that grizzly," he said quietly, his voice carrying a note of wonder at seeing one of North America's most impressive predators in its natural habitat. Carl Rodriguez, seated at the rear of the bus, craned his neck to get a better view of the bear and immediately began making jokes about the situation. "Maybe he's here to bust us out," Carl said with a smirk, drawing nervous chuckles from some of the other inmates. "That ain't nothing to joke about," Bobby Sullivan responded, his expression serious as he watched the massive animal through the reinforced window. "My grandfather used to tell stories about grizzlies up in Alaska. They can tear a man apart like paper." Jennifer Vasquez seemed genuinely frightened by the bear's presence, her slight frame tensing visibly as she pressed herself against the side of the bus farthest from the animal. "How close is it going to get?" she asked, her voice carrying a note of anxiety that reflected her general nervousness about her transfer to the new facility. Thomas Kowalski watched the bear with the same detached interest that he displayed toward most aspects of his incarceration, his depression and guilt, leaving him largely indifferent to external events that might excite or concern other people. William Carver remained silent, his attention divided between the bear sighting and his constant awareness of the potential threats posed by his fellow inmates. At 10:23 a.m., bear number G247 made the decision that would transform this routine transport into one of the most tragic wildlife encounters in Montana's history. Rather than continuing parallel to the highway before eventually returning to the forest, the bear began moving directly toward the road, apparently drawn by the sounds and scents emanating from the prison transport bus. His movement was deliberate and purposeful, displaying none of the hesitation or avoidance behavior that typically characterized bear responses to vehicles and human activity. Martin Hayes immediately recognized the change in the bear's behavior and began to accelerate the bus, hoping to pass the animal before it could reach the highway. However, the transport bus's weight and size limited its acceleration capabilities, and the bear's surprising speed quickly became apparent as it continued its approach toward the road. "He's coming this way," Becca observed, her training kicking in as she reached for the radio microphone. "Dispatch, this is Transport 74. We have a large grizzly bear approaching the highway at our current location, approximately 15 miles north of Butte on Highway 15. "Copy that, Transport 74. Can you provide more details on the bear's behavior and your current status?" Jennifer Walsh responded from the dispatch center, her voice betraying no hint of concern despite the unusual nature of the report. "The bear appears to be moving directly toward the highway. We are attempting to pass the location and continue north," Becca replied, her eyes fixed on the massive animal that was now less than 20 yards from the edge of the roadway. Bear number G247's approach to the highway represented a critical moment in the developing crisis, as his behavior transitioned from simple curiosity to active pursuit of what he perceived as a potential opportunity. The combination of scents from the bus, including human odors, food traces from the officers' lunches, and various other organic compounds, created a powerful attractant that overrode the bear's natural caution around human activities. Additionally, the bus's low speed and large size may have triggered predatory instincts that identified it as potential prey rather than a threat to be avoided. As the transport bus drew parallel with the bear's position, Martin Hayes faced a critical decision that would have profound consequences for everyone aboard the vehicle. He could attempt to accelerate past the bear, hoping that the animal would lose interest once the bus had passed, or he could reduce speed and wait for the bear to move away from the highway before proceeding. His choice to accelerate, while consistent with his training and experience, inadvertently triggered the aggressive response that transformed Bear G247 from a curious observer into an active aggressor. The sound of the bus's diesel engine accelerating, combined with the sight of the large vehicle moving rapidly past his position, apparently triggered a chase response in Bear G247 that was similar to the behavior displayed by bears pursuing fleeing prey animals. Rather than being intimidated by the bus's size and noise, the bear seemed to interpret the acceleration as a challenge or an opportunity that required immediate action. At 10:24 a.m., Bear G247 burst from the tree line and onto Highway 15 directly behind the prison transport bus, his powerful legs propelling his 650-pound frame at speeds approaching 30 miles per hour. The sight of the massive predator in active pursuit of their vehicle marked the beginning of a nightmare scenario that neither officer had ever imagined encountering during their corrections careers. "Jesus Christ, he's chasing us!" Martin shouted, his calm professional demeanor cracking for the first time as he pressed the accelerator pedal to the floor in a desperate attempt to outdistance the pursuing bear. Becca Torino immediately grabbed the radio microphone with both hands, her voice rising with urgency as she broadcast their situation to the dispatch center. "Dispatch, this is Transport 74. We have a grizzly bear in active pursuit of our vehicle. Repeat, grizzly bear chasing the transport bus on Highway 15. The 6 inmates in the rear compartment had all turned to watch the unfolding drama, their various conversations and complaints about the transport forgotten as they witnessed one of nature's most powerful predators bearing down on their vehicle with obvious aggressive intent. The sight of the massive bear running at full speed directly behind the bus created a level of tension and fear that transcended the usual boundaries between inmates and officers, as everyone aboard the transport suddenly shared a common interest in escaping the approaching danger. "How fast can this thing go?" Marcus Thompson asked, his voice tight with concern, as he watched the bear steadily gaining ground on the heavily loaded transport bus. "Not fast enough, Bobby Sullivan replied grimly, his knowledge of heavy vehicles from his construction background allowing him to recognize that the bus was operating near its maximum capability. Martin Hayes pushed the transport bus to its mechanical limits, but the combination of the vehicle's weight, the uphill grade of the highway, and the aging engine's power limitations meant that their maximum speed was insufficient to outpace the pursuing grizzly bear. The gap between the bear and the rear of the bus continued to shrink with each passing second, creating a sense of impending doom that affected everyone aboard the transport. Bear number G247's pursuit of the bus represented the culmination of millions of years of evolutionary development that had produced one of nature's most efficient predators. His cardiovascular system could sustain high-speed pursuit for extended periods. His muscular system generated tremendous power with each stride, and his mental processes focused entirely on the target he had identified as prey. The bear's previous encounters with humans had not prepared him for the mechanical nature of his current quarry, and his predatory instincts were driving him toward a confrontation that would prove catastrophic for everyone involved. At 10:25 a.m., Bear G247 caught up with the rear of the prison transport bus, his massive front paws making contact with the vehicle's bumper and rear door. The impact of 650 pounds of muscle and bone striking the bus at high speed created a tremendous metallic crash that reverberated throughout the passenger compartment, causing several inmates to cry out in alarm and terror. The bear's claws, each measuring up to 4 inches in length and designed for digging and gripping, scraped across the bus's steel exterior with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard, magnified 100-fold. The scratching and banging sounds created by the bear's attempts to gain purchase on the smooth metal surface added to the cacophony of noise that filled the transport, while the vehicle's suspension system struggled to cope with the additional weight and the dynamic loading created by the bear's movements. "He's on the bus! He's on the bus!" Jennifer Vasquez screamed, her voice high and shrill with terror, as she pressed herself against the far side of her seat in a futile attempt to distance herself from the threat. Martin Hayes felt the rear of the transport bus lifting slightly as the bear's weight shifted the vehicle's center of gravity, affecting its handling characteristics and making it increasingly difficult to maintain control. The steering wheel vibrated in his hands as the bear's movements transmitted themselves through the vehicle's frame, and he struggled to keep the bus centered on the highway while maintaining maximum speed. "Dispatch! The bear is on the vehicle. Repeat, the grizzly is on the transport," Becca Torino broadcast, her training enabling her to maintain communication protocols even as her stress levels reached critical levels. "Transport 7-4, we are dispatching emergency units to your location. Can you provide an updated position?" Jennifer Walsh responded from the dispatch center, her voice now clearly reflecting the urgency of the situation. "Northbound Highway 15, approximately 14 miles north of Butte. The bear is attacking the rear of the vehicle," Becca replied, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror that showed the massive predator clinging to the back of their bus. The Montana Department of Corrections dispatcher immediately initiated emergency protocols that would bring multiple law enforcement and emergency medical services agencies into coordinated response mode. However, the remote location of the incident meant that the nearest assistance was at least 15 minutes away, leaving the transport crew and inmates to face the escalating crisis without any immediate support. Bear number G247's attack on the transport bus represented a unique situation in the annals of human-wildlife conflict, as most bear attacks involved individuals or small groups encountered in wilderness settings rather than a heavily armored vehicle containing multiple occupants. The bear's persistence in pursuing and attacking the moving vehicle suggested an unusual level of aggression that exceeded typical bear behavior patterns, possibly indicating extreme hunger, territorial stress, or previous negative conditioning experiences that had modified his natural responses to human activities. At 10:26 a.m., the situation escalated dramatically as bear number G247 managed to position himself on the rear bumper of the transport bus and began using his massive front paws to attack the reinforced door that provided access to the prisoner compartment. The door, designed to withstand human escape attempts and minor impacts, had not been engineered to resist the focused assault of a 650-pound grizzly bear equipped with 4-inch claws and jaws capable of exerting over 1,500 pounds of pressure per square inch. The bear's initial attacks on the door created deep gouges in the steel surface and caused the locking mechanism to shift slightly in its mounting bracket. Each successive blow from the bear's claws transmitted shock waves through the bus's frame that could be felt by every occupant, while the sound of metal being torn and twisted filled the passenger compartment with an increasingly terrifying soundtrack of destruction. "The door's not going to hold!" Carl Rodriguez shouted from his position at the rear of the bus, where he had the clearest view of the bear's assault on their only barrier of protection. Thomas Kowalski, despite his usual detachment from his surroundings, found himself gripped by a primal fear that penetrated even his medication-dulled consciousness. "We're all going to die," he said quietly, his voice carrying a matter-of-fact tone that seemed to accept the inevitability of their fate. "Shut up," Marcus Thompson snapped, his survival instincts kicking in as he began to assess their tactical situation. "The door's steel. It should hold. We need to think about what we do if it doesn't." William Carver remained silent, his face pale with terror as he contemplated the possibility that his life might end in a manner far more violent than anything he had experienced during his previous encounters with hostile inmates. The irony of potentially dying alongside the criminals he had tried to distance himself from was not lost on him, though he lacked the emotional capacity to appreciate the philosophical implications of their shared predicament. Martin Hayes continued to push the transport bus to its maximum speed, hoping against hope that he could find a way to dislodge the attacking bear or reach a location where help might be available. The highway ahead remained empty of other traffic, a circumstance that would normally have been welcomed during a prisoner transport, but that now meant there were no witnesses to their ordeal and no potential sources of assistance. The bear's attack on the door intensified as Bear G247 apparently recognized that the metal barrier was beginning to weaken under his assault. His claws found purchase in the deep gouges he had already created, allowing him to apply tremendous leverage that bent and twisted the door frame beyond its design specifications. The locking mechanism, subjected to forces far exceeding its rated capacity, began to fail as metal fatigue compromised its structural integrity. At 10:27 a.m., the inevitable occurred as bear number G247's relentless assault finally overcame the transport door's defenses. The lock mechanism failed with a sharp metallic snap that was audible even over the engine noise and the bear's vocalizations, and the heavy steel door swung open to reveal the massive predator framed in the doorway like some primordial nightmare given flesh and form. The sight of the grizzly bear standing in the doorway of their transport created a moment of absolute terror that seemed to freeze time itself. Bear number G247's massive head nearly filled the entire opening, his small dark eyes scanning the interior of the bus as he assessed the situation and selected his first target. His lips were pulled back to reveal canine teeth nearly 3 inches long, designed by evolution to crush bones and tear flesh with devastating efficiency. "Oh God, oh God, oh God!" Jennifer Vasquez chanted repeatedly, her voice rising to a shriek as she stared at the enormous predator that now had unrestricted access to their confined space. The bear's entry into the transport bus marked the beginning of the most horrific 15 minutes in the history of Montana's correction system, as 6 shackled inmates and 2 armed officers found themselves trapped in close quarters with one of North America's apex predators. The confines of the bus, which had been designed to prevent escape, now became a death trap that prevented any possibility of flight from the attacking animal. Bear number G247's first target was Carl Rodriguez, whose position at the rear of the bus placed him closest to the compromised door. The bear's attack was swift and devastating, his massive jaws clamping down on Carl's left shoulder and upper arm with crushing force that shattered bones and severed muscle tissue with surgical precision. Carl's screams of agony filled the bus as the bear's teeth penetrated through his orange jumpsuit and deep into his flesh, while his shackled legs prevented him from escaping or even assuming a defensive posture. The sound of Carl's bones breaking was audible throughout the passenger compartment, a sickening crack that was immediately followed by the wet, tearing noise of flesh being separated from bone. Blood began to flow immediately, spattering the seats and floor around Carl's position as Bear G247 continued his assault with single-minded ferocity. Bobby Sullivan, seated directly across the aisle from Carl, found himself within reach of the bear's claws as the animal continued its attack on the first victim. The bear's right front paw, equipped with claws designed for digging through frozen ground and stripping bark from trees, raked across Bobby's face and chest, opening deep lacerations that began bleeding profusely. Bobby's screams joined Carl's in a horrific chorus of agony that filled the bus with the sounds of human suffering. Martin Hayes faced an impossible decision as he heard the sounds of the attack beginning in the passenger compartment. He could stop the bus and attempt to intervene, possibly saving some of the inmates, but also risking his own life and that of his partner. Alternatively, he could continue driving in hopes of reaching a location where help might be available, but each second of delay meant additional suffering for the victims in the rear of the bus. "We have to stop," Becca Torino shouted, drawing her service weapon as she prepared to enter the passenger compartment and engage the attacking bear. "If we stop, we're all dead," Martin replied, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. "I'm looking for somewhere we can get help." The tactical situation faced by the officers represented one of the most challenging scenarios in law enforcement, as their duty to protect the inmates in their custody conflicted with their instinct for self-preservation and their responsibility to each other. The confined space of the bus made it virtually impossible to engage the bear with firearms without risking injury to the human occupants, while the inmates' restraints prevented them from fleeing or defending themselves against the attack. Bear number G247's assault on Carl Rodriguez continued with relentless intensity, as the predator's instincts drove him to disable his prey completely before moving on to assess other threats. The bear's jaws remained clamped on Carl's shoulder, grinding and crushing the bones, while his claws raked repeatedly across the young man's torso, opening multiple wounds that bled freely and added to the growing pool of blood on the bus floor. Carl's initial screams of pain gradually weakened to moans and whimpers as shock began to set in, his body's natural response to massive trauma causing his blood pressure to drop and his consciousness to fade. The combination of blood loss, pain and terror created a downward spiral that threatened to end his life, even if the bear's attack ceased immediately. Jennifer Vasquez, witnessing the savage attack on Carl, began hyperventilating as her panic response overwhelmed her ability to process the horrific scene unfolding just feet away from her position. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, threatening to cause her to lose consciousness from carbon dioxide depletion as her body struggled to cope with the extreme stress of the situation. Thomas Kowalski, his depression momentarily forgotten in the face of immediate mortal danger, began trying to free himself from his restraints in a desperate attempt to help Carl, or at least to improve his own chances of survival. The leg shackles and waist chain that secured him to his seat had been designed to prevent exactly this type of escape attempt, and his efforts only resulted in cutting into his wrists and ankles as the metal restraints bit into his flesh. Marcus Thompson, despite his own terror, began encouraging the other inmates to remain calm and look for opportunities to help each other. Stay cool," he repeated, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the attack and Carl's weakening cries. "We got to think. We got to work together." The Bears' attack on Bobby Sullivan intensified as Bear number G247 apparently recognized the larger man as a potential threat that needed to be neutralized. The Bear released his grip on Carl's mangled shoulder and turned his attention to Bobby, whose position across the aisle had made him accessible to the predator's claws, but had initially protected him from the full force of the animal's jaws. Bear number G247's massive head struck Bobby in the chest with tremendous force, knocking him backward against his seat and driving the air from his lungs in a painful whoosh. The bear's claws found purchase in Bobby's orange jumpsuit, tearing through the fabric and into the flesh beneath as the animal attempted to pull him closer for a more decisive attack. Bobby's construction worker background had given him considerable physical strength and a high tolerance for pain, advantages that now served him well as he struggled against the bear's assault. However, his shackled condition severely limited his ability to defend himself or escape, leaving him essentially helpless against an opponent that outweighed him by nearly 400 pounds and possessed natural weapons that could easily penetrate his body's defenses. "Help me! Somebody help me!" Bobby screamed, his previous bravado completely forgotten as he faced the reality of his situation. His appeals for assistance echoed through the bus, but there was nothing his fellow inmates could do to intervene, given their own restraints and the confined space that prevented any coordinated response. At 10:28 a.m., Martin Hayes spotted a Montana Highway Patrol vehicle approaching from the opposite direction, its emergency lights activated as it responded to the dispatch center's request for assistance. Martin immediately began flashing his headlights and sounding the bus's horn in an attempt to attract the troopers' attention and communicate the urgent nature of their situation. Trooper Daniel Martinez, a 6-year veteran of the Montana Highway Patrol, had been responding to the report of a bear encounter with a corrections transport when he spotted the prison bus approaching at high speed with its headlights flashing. His training immediately told him that the situation had escalated beyond a simple wildlife sighting, and he quickly radioed for additional backup while executing a U-turn to follow the transport bus. "Dispatch, this is Unit 47. I have visual contact with Transport 74, requesting immediate backup and emergency medical services. This appears to be a major incident," Trooper Martinez broadcast as he accelerated to catch up with the speeding prison bus. The sight of law enforcement assistance arriving provided a momentary spark of hope for the occupants of the transport bus. But Bear number G247's attack continued without any indication that the predator was aware of or concerned about the approaching help. The bear's focus remained entirely fixed on the immediate threats and opportunities presented by the humans trapped within his reach. Bear number G247's assault on Bobby Sullivan reached a crescendo as the predator managed to get his jaws around Bobby's right arm, clamping down with crushing force that pulverized bones and severed major blood vessels. Bobby's screams reached a new level of intensity as the bear's teeth penetrated through muscle and scraped against bone, while his attempts to pull free only resulted in additional tissue damage as the bear's grip tightened. The sound of Bobby's arm bones breaking was clearly audible to everyone in the bus, a sickening crunch that was immediately followed by the wet, sucking noise of the bear's teeth withdrawing from the wound they had created. Blood began flowing freely from Bobby's mangled arm, adding to the growing pool of bodily fluids that was spreading across the bus floor and creating a slippery, treacherous surface that would complicate any rescue attempts. Jennifer Vasquez, already hyperventilating from panic, vomited violently as the sight and smell of fresh blood triggered her gag reflex. The confined space of the bus meant that the odor of blood, vomit, and human waste created by terror was becoming increasingly overwhelming, adding another layer of difficulty to an already impossible situation. William Carver, despite his fear, found himself analyzing the bear's behavior with the same methodical approach he had once applied to teaching mathematics. He observed that the bear seemed to be focusing its attacks on the inmates who moved the most or made the most noise, suggesting that remaining motionless might improve one's chances of survival. However, his academic understanding of animal behavior provided little comfort in the face of the immediate physical threat represented by 650 pounds of predatory muscle just feet away from his position. At 10:29 a.m., Bear G247 made a decision that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives as the predator turned his attention toward the front of the bus where the corrections officers were positioned. The bear's movement down the narrow aisle was hampered by his massive size, but his determination to investigate every potential threat or food source drove him forward despite the physical constraints of the environment. Martin Hayes, seeing the bear approaching their position, made the agonizing decision to stop the transport bus and attempt to evacuate through the front door. The alternative of continuing to drive while the bear attacked his partner was unacceptable. But stopping the vehicle would also eliminate their mobility and potentially trap them in close quarters with the predator. "Becca, we're getting out now!" Martin shouted as he applied the brakes and brought the bus to a halt on the shoulder of Highway 15. Becca Torino had drawn her service weapon, a DOT, .40 caliber semi-automatic pistol loaded with hollow-point ammunition, designed for maximum stopping power against human targets. However, she understood that handgun ammunition was generally considered inadequate for stopping a determined grizzly bear attack, particularly given the animal's thick hide, dense muscle mass, and adrenaline-fueled aggression. "Go, go, go!" Becca replied, positioning herself between Martin and the approaching bear while preparing to engage the animal with her firearm. The decision to abandon the transport bus represented a tactical gamble that could either save their lives or result in their deaths, as they would be giving up the protection provided by the vehicle's steel framework in exchange for the mobility and escape options available in the open environment. However, the bear's demonstrated ability to breach the bus's security systems and his obvious intent to attack every occupant left them with few viable alternatives. Bear number G247's approach toward the front of the bus brought him within range of Becca Torino's firearm, creating the first opportunity for the officers to actively resist the attack rather than simply enduring it. However, the presence of injured inmates in the line of fire complicated her targeting solutions and required her to carefully consider the potential consequences of each shot. The bear's massive head appeared around the corner of the driver's partition, his dark eyes fixed on Martin Hayes as he identified the next target for his aggression. Bear number G247's lips were pulled back in a snarl that revealed his massive canine teeth, now stained with blood from his previous attacks, while his breathing created a rumbling sound that seemed to emanate from deep within his chest. "Shoot him!" Martin screamed as he struggled to open the front door of the bus while keeping his eyes fixed on the approaching predator. Becca Torino aimed her weapon at the bear's head and squeezed the trigger, sending a .40 caliber hollow-point bullet toward the animal's skull at a muzzle velocity of over 1,000 feet per second. The shot struck Bear G247 in the left side of his massive head, penetrating through his thick hide and into the muscle tissue beneath, but failing to reach the brain cavity that would have been necessary to stop his attack immediately. The impact of the bullet caused the bear to roar with pain and anger, a sound that filled the confined space of the bus with a volume and intensity that seemed to shake the vehicle's frame. However, rather than disabling the animal, the wound only served to increase his aggression as pain and territorial instincts combined to drive him into a berserker fury that made him even more dangerous than before. Bear number G247's response to being shot was swift and devastating as he lunged forward with surprising speed and struck Martin Hayes with his massive right front paw. The impact knocked Martin backward against the front windshield of the bus, while the bear's claws raked across his chest and face, opening deep lacerations that began bleeding immediately. Martin's screams joined those of the inmates as he became the bear's newest victim, his body pressed against the windshield by the animal's weight, while the bear's jaws snapped inches from his face. The smell of the bear's breath, a combination of carrion and fresh blood, filled Martin's nostrils as he struggled desperately to push the massive predator away from his body. Becker fired 3 more shots in rapid succession, each bullet striking the bear in the torso and causing additional wounds that bled freely, but failed to stop his attack on her partner. The .40 caliber ammunition, while effective against human targets, simply lacked the mass and penetration necessary to reach the bear's vital organs through his thick hide, dense muscle, and heavy bone structure. The sound of gunfire in the confined space of the bus was deafening, creating a ringing in everyone's ears that would persist for hours after the attack ended. The muzzle flashes illuminated the horrific scene in stark detail, revealing the extent of the carnage that had already occurred and the imminent threat facing the remaining occupants. Trooper Martinez, who had been following the transport bus, witnessed the vehicle come to a sudden stop and immediately heard the sound of gunfire from within the passenger compartment. His radio crackled to life as he reported the escalating situation to the dispatch center, while positioning his patrol car to provide tactical support for whatever was occurring inside the bus. Dispatch, shots fired at the transport bus location. I need immediate backup and emergency medical services. This is a major incident. Trooper Martinez broadcasted as he exited his patrol vehicle with his rifle in hand. The Montana Highway Patrol troopers' arrival at the scene provided additional firepower that might be capable of stopping the bear's attack, but his position outside the bus limited his ability to engage the animal without risking injury to the human occupants. The tactical situation required careful coordination to maximize the effectiveness of their response, while minimizing the risk of friendly fire casualties. Bear number G247's attack on Martin Hayes continued with relentless intensity as the predator's jaws clamped down on Martin's left shoulder with crushing force. The sound of bones breaking was clearly audible even over Martin's screams, while blood began flowing from the wound in a steady stream that quickly soaked his uniform shirt. Martin's attempts to free himself from the bear's grip only resulted in additional tissue damage as the animal's teeth ground against his bones and tore through muscle fibers with each movement. The pain was beyond anything Martin had ever experienced, a white-hot agony that threatened to cause him to lose consciousness and leave him completely defenseless against the continuing attack. Becca Torino emptied her magazine into the bear's torso, each shot causing visible impacts that created wounds in the animal's thick hide, but failed to achieve the immediate incapacitation that was desperately needed. The bear's adrenaline and the natural toughness of his species allowed him to continue his attack despite sustaining multiple gunshot wounds that would have been immediately fatal to most other animals. The tactical situation had devolved into chaos, as the bear's presence in the confined space prevented any coordinated response from the human occupants. The injured inmates were unable to provide any assistance due to their restraints and their own wounds, while the officers found themselves outmatched by an opponent whose natural weapons and physical capabilities exceeded their training and equipment. At 10:31 a.m., the crisis reached its climax as Bear G247, apparently recognizing that his current position in the bus made him vulnerable to continued gunfire, began backing toward the rear exit while maintaining his grip on Martin Hayes. The bear's intention seemed to be to drag his victim from the vehicle where he could complete his attack without the interference of the other humans. Martin's body was pulled from the driver's seat as the bear retreated, his legs dragging across the bus floor while the animal's jaws remained clamped on his shoulder. The trail of blood that marked their progress down the aisle provided stark evidence of the severity of Martin's injuries and the likelihood that he would not survive much longer without immediate medical intervention. "Martin!" Becca screamed, reloading her weapon with a fresh magazine while attempting to follow the bear and her wounded partner toward the rear of the bus. The other inmates watched in horror as Martin Hayes, the man who had treated them with professional respect and dignity throughout their transport, was being dragged away by the massive predator like a piece of meat. The sight of the corrections officer's obvious agony and the trail of blood he was leaving behind created a level of trauma that would affect the survivors for the rest of their lives. Marcus Thompson, despite his own restraints and the obvious danger, began encouraging the others to work together to help Martin if possible. "We got to do something," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the sounds of the bear's movements and Martin's weakening cries. "What can we do?" Thomas Kowalski replied, his depression momentarily replaced by frustration at their helpless situation. "We're chained up like animals." Bear number G247's retreat from the bus with Martin Hayes marked a brief respite in the attack for the remaining occupants, as the predator's focus shifted entirely to his current victim and away from the other potential targets. However, the sight of their protector being dragged away by the bear created a new level of terror among the inmates, as they realized that their survival now depended entirely on their own resources and the assistance of the single remaining officer. Trooper Martinez, positioned outside the bus with his patrol rifle, finally had a clear shot at the bear as the animal emerged from the vehicle with Martin Hayes in his jaws. The .308 caliber rifle represented significantly more firepower than the handguns that had proved ineffective against the bear's thick hide and massive bone structure, offering the first real hope of stopping the attack before additional victims were claimed. The trooper's first shot struck Bear G247 in the chest with devastating effect, the high-velocity rifle bullet penetrating deep into the animal's torso and causing massive internal damage that immediately began affecting his ability to continue the attack. However, the bear's grip on Martin remained firm, and his dying reflexes could still cause fatal injuries to his victim, even as his own life ebbed away. Bear number G247's roar of pain and rage filled the mountain air as the rifle bullet found its mark, a sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding peaks and valleys with primordial intensity. The bear's massive head turned toward the source of this new threat, his dark eyes reflecting a combination of pain, anger, and the growing confusion that accompanied his approaching death. Trooper Martinez fired 2 additional shots in rapid succession, both bullets striking the bear in vital areas and causing the massive predator to finally release his grip on Martin Hayes. Bear number G247 staggered backward, his legs beginning to fail as the damage from multiple rifle wounds finally overcame his tremendous vitality and will to survive. The bear's death was not immediate, as his massive cardiovascular system and natural toughness allowed him to remain conscious and potentially dangerous for several more minutes. However, the combination of gunshot wounds, blood loss, and organ damage had initiated a cascade of physiological failure that would inevitably result in his death within a matter of minutes. Martin Hayes lay motionless on the ground beside the dying bear, his body broken and bloodied from the prolonged attack, but still showing signs of life. The corrections officer's breathing was shallow and irregular, indicating severe trauma that would require immediate medical intervention if he was to have any chance of survival. Becca Torino emerged from the bus and immediately began providing first aid to her wounded partner, applying pressure to his wounds in an attempt to control the bleeding while calling for emergency medical assistance. Her training in basic life support provided her with the skills necessary to stabilize Martin's condition temporarily, but his injuries were beyond the scope of field treatment and would require surgical intervention. "Officer down! Officer down! We need immediate medical evacuation," Becca broadcast over her radio, her voice cracking with emotion as she surveyed the extent of her partner's injuries. The scene that confronted the first responders, who began arriving at the location over the next 20 minutes, represented one of the most horrific wildlife encounters in Montana's recorded history. The interior of the prison transport bus was covered with blood from multiple victims, while the survivors sat in shock, still restrained by their shackles and unable to move freely, despite the obvious need for medical attention. Carl Rodriguez remained conscious, but in critical condition from his wounds, his left shoulder and arm mangled by the bear's initial attack. The combination of blood loss, shock, and severe tissue damage had left him barely conscious, his breathing shallow and his skin pale from the effects of hypovolemia. Bobby Sullivan's injuries were equally severe, with his right arm crushed and multiple lacerations across his face and chest. The construction worker's previous physical conditioning had helped him survive the attack, but his wounds required immediate surgical repair to prevent permanent disability or death from complications. The other inmates had escaped physical injury but were suffering from severe psychological trauma that would require extensive counseling and treatment. The sight of their fellow prisoners being mauled by the bear, combined with the sounds and smells of the attack, had created memories that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Emergency medical services personnel who arrived at the scene faced the challenging task of providing treatment to multiple trauma victims in a confined environment while dealing with the presence of a dying grizzly bear that could still pose a threat. The bear's continued movement and occasional vocalizations created an atmosphere of tension that complicated the medical response and required law enforcement personnel to maintain a protective perimeter around the treatment area. Dr. Amanda Foster, an emergency medicine physician with 12 years of experience treating trauma victims, arrived at the scene aboard the first medical helicopter dispatched from St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula. Her initial assessment of the casualties revealed the extent of the carnage and the need for immediate surgical intervention for the most seriously injured victims. "We need to get these people to trauma centers immediately," Dr. Foster announced after completing her triage evaluation. "The corrections officer and the 2 inmates have life-threatening injuries that require surgical repair." The logistics of evacuating multiple trauma victims from a remote mountain highway required coordination between several helicopter crews and ground ambulances, creating a complex medical operation that tested the capabilities of Montana's emergency response system. The nearest trauma center was over 50 miles away, requiring rapid transport to prevent the victims from dying of their injuries during transit. Martin Hayes was the first victim to be evacuated, his condition considered the most critical due to the duration and severity of the bear's attack on his body. The medical crew worked frantically to stabilize his blood pressure and breathing while preparing him for transport to the trauma center, where orthopedic surgeons and vascular specialists were standing by to repair his damaged tissues. Carl Rodriguez and Bobby Sullivan were evacuated in the second helicopter, their injuries requiring immediate attention, but considered slightly less critical than those suffered by the corrections officer. The medical personnel treating them faced the challenge of managing multiple trauma cases simultaneously while dealing with the psychological effects of the attack that were affecting the victims' cooperation with treatment. The investigation into the bear attack began immediately, with wildlife biologists from Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks arriving at the scene to examine bear number G247's remains and attempt to determine what had triggered such unusual aggressive behavior. The bear's size, age, and physical condition suggested that he was a healthy adult male who should not have exhibited such extreme aggression toward humans under normal circumstances. Dr. Sarah Chen, the wildlife biologist who had previously studied bear G247, arrived at the scene 3 hours after the attack and immediately began collecting tissue samples and other evidence that might explain the bear's behavior. Her preliminary examination revealed that the bear appeared to be in good physical condition with adequate fat reserves, suggesting that starvation had not been a primary motivating factor in the attack. This is completely unprecedented behavior for this species, Dr. Chen observed as she examined the bear's remains. Adult male grizzlies occasionally attack humans, but the persistence and intensity of this attack suggests something beyond normal territorial or food-seeking behavior. The Montana Department of Corrections launched its own investigation into the incident, focusing on security protocols and procedures that might have contributed to the severity of the attack. The agency faced difficult questions about the adequacy of their vehicle security systems and the training provided to transport officers for dealing with wildlife encounters. Lieutenant Colonel James Mitchell arrived at the scene as the investigation began, his military bearing and professional demeanor unable to completely mask the emotional impact of seeing his personnel and charges injured in such a horrific manner. The transport commander faced the challenging task of coordinating with multiple agencies while ensuring that the corrections department's interests were protected during the investigation process. "This is a tragedy that affects everyone involved," Mitchell stated during an impromptu press conference held at the scene. "Our thoughts and prayers are with Officer Hayes and his family, as well as with the injured inmates and their families. We will cooperate fully with all investigations to determine how this incident occurred and how similar tragedies can be prevented in the future." The media response to the bear attack was immediate and intense, with news crews from across the region converging on the scene to document the aftermath of what was already being described as one of the most unusual wildlife encounters in American history. The combination of law enforcement, corrections personnel, inmates, and a grizzly bear created a complex narrative that captured public attention and raised questions about wildlife management, prison security, and public safety in remote areas. Local television reporter Jessica Martinez, who had covered numerous wildlife stories during her career, struggled to find adequate words to describe the scene that confronted her upon arrival at the attack site. The amount of blood visible in and around the transport bus, combined with the massive size of the dead bear, created a visual impact that conveyed the horrific nature of the encounter more effectively than any verbal description. "What we're seeing here today represents every nightmare scenario involving human-wildlife conflict," Martinez reported during her live broadcast from the scene. "The question that everyone is asking is how a routine prisoner transport became the target of such an unprecedented attack by one of North America's most feared predators." The hospital treatment of the bear attack victims required coordination between multiple medical specialties and represented one of the most complex trauma cases ever handled by Montana's medical system. St. Patrick Hospital in Missoula, which received the most seriously injured victims, activated its mass casualty protocols to ensure that adequate resources were available for the extended surgical procedures that would be required. Dr. Robert Chen, the chief of orthopedic surgery at St. Patrick Hospital, led the team that worked to repair Martin Hayes' extensive injuries. The corrections officer's left shoulder had been crushed by the bear's jaws, requiring reconstruction of multiple bones and the reattachment of severed muscles and tendons. Additional injuries to his chest and face required the services of plastic surgeons and other specialists working in coordination to restore function and minimize permanent disability. Officer Hayes survived injuries that would have been fatal in most circumstances, Dr. Chen explained during a press briefing held 12 hours after the attack. His physical conditioning and the rapid response of emergency medical services saved his life, but he faces a long and difficult recovery process that will require multiple surgeries and extensive rehabilitation. Carl Rodriguez's treatment required amputation of his left arm above the elbow, as the damage inflicted by the bear's jaws had destroyed too much tissue and bone to permit salvage of the limb. The young man's adjustment to his disability would be complicated by his incarceration and the limited rehabilitation services available within the corrections system, creating additional challenges for his long-term recovery. Bobby Sullivan underwent successful surgical repair of his right arm, though permanent nerve damage resulted in limited function that would affect his ability to work in construction upon his eventual release from prison. The facial lacerations he had sustained required plastic surgery to minimize scarring, but the psychological trauma of the attack would prove more difficult to address than his physical injuries. The psychological impact of the bear attack extended far beyond the direct victims to include their families, fellow inmates, corrections personnel, and the broader communities that had been touched by the tragedy. The Montana Department of Corrections provided counseling services for all personnel who had been involved in the incident response, recognizing that secondary trauma could affect individuals who had not been directly injured but had witnessed the aftermath of the attack. Sarah Hayes, Martin's wife, received the news of her husband's injuries while at work at her real estate office in Missoula. The phone call from Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell informing her that Martin had been injured in the line of duty during a transport operation initially suggested a routine incident, but the request that she come to the hospital immediately indicated that the situation was far more serious than first implied. When I arrived at the hospital and saw all the medical personnel and emergency vehicles, I knew that something terrible had happened, Sarah recalled in an interview weeks after the attack. Nothing could have prepared me for seeing Martin in the intensive care unit, connected to machines and covered in bandages. The doctors explained that he had been attacked by a bear, but it took time for the full reality of what had happened to sink in. The Hayes family faced not only the immediate crisis of Martin's injuries, but also the long-term financial and emotional challenges that would accompany his recovery and rehabilitation. The extent of his injuries made it uncertain whether he would ever be able to return to work in law enforcement, creating concerns about the family's financial security and future plans. Emma Hayes, Martin's 13-year-old daughter, struggled to understand how her father's routine work assignment had resulted in such catastrophic injuries. Her previous perception of her father as a strong and capable protector had been shattered by the realization that even experienced law enforcement officers could be vulnerable to the unpredictable dangers that existed in their world. Michael Hayes, Martin's 11-year-old son, displayed different responses to his father's injuries, alternating between anger at the bear that had hurt his father and guilt over his own inability to have prevented the attack. The family's church community provided substantial support during the crisis, but the psychological impact of the incident would require professional counseling for all family members. The legal implications of the bear attack created complex questions about liability, workers' compensation, and the responsibilities of various government agencies involved in prisoner transport and wildlife management. The Montana Department of Corrections faced potential lawsuits from injured inmates who might claim that inadequate security measures had contributed to their injuries, while the families of victims sought compensation for medical expenses and long-term care costs. Attorney Michael Rodriguez, who had no relation to inmate Carl Rodriguez, but who specialized in personal injury cases involving government agencies, filed the first lawsuit related to the bear attack within 2 weeks of the incident. His suit claimed that the Montana Department of Corrections had failed to provide adequate protection for inmates during transport, and that the state's wildlife management policies had contributed to the aggressive behavior displayed by bear number G247. Our clients were in the custody and care of the state of Montana when they were attacked by this bear, Rodriguez explained during a press conference announcing the lawsuit. The state has a fundamental responsibility to protect individuals who are in their custody, and the failure to anticipate and prevent this attack represents a breach of that duty. The Montana Attorney General's office responded to the lawsuit by arguing that the bear attack represented an unforeseeable act of nature that could not have been prevented through reasonable security measures. Their position emphasized the unprecedented nature of the attack and the lack of any prior incidents that might have indicated the need for enhanced wildlife protection protocols during prisoner transport operations. The workers' compensation claim filed on behalf of Martin Hayes raised different legal questions related to the scope of coverage for law enforcement officers injured in the line of duty. While there was no question that his injuries had occurred during the performance of his official duties, the unusual nature of the attack created uncertainties about the extent of benefits available for his treatment and rehabilitation. The Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks Department faced its own legal challenges related to the management of bear number G247 and the adequacy of their wildlife monitoring programs. The fact that the bear had been previously tagged and studied by their personnel created questions about whether his aggressive tendencies should have been detected and addressed before the attack occurred. Dr. Sarah Chen's research files on bear G247 became critical evidence in determining whether the bear had displayed warning signs of aggressive behavior that should have triggered enhanced monitoring or removal from the area. Her notes indicated that the bear had shown more territorial behavior than was typical for the species, but nothing in her observations had suggested the potential for such an extreme attack on humans. The investigation into bear number G247's behavior ultimately revealed several factors that may have contributed to his unusual aggression. Toxicology tests conducted on tissue samples from the bear's remains showed no evidence of disease, parasites, or toxic substances that might have affected his neurological function. However, dental examination revealed evidence of severe tooth pain from infected molars that could have increased his irritability and made him more prone to aggressive responses. Wildlife biologists theorized that the combination of post-hibernation hunger, territorial stress from increased human activity in his range, and chronic pain from his dental problems had created a perfect storm of factors that led to the attack on the prison transport. The bus's size, noise, and distinctive appearance may have triggered a territorial response that escalated into the full-scale attack that claimed 1 life and injured 6 others. The media coverage of the bear attack continued for weeks after the initial incident, with follow-up stories tracking the recovery of the victims and the ongoing investigations into the cause of the attack. National news networks picked up the story due to its unusual nature and the dramatic footage of the blood-stained transport bus and the massive bear that had caused such destruction. Wildlife documentaries and educational programs began featuring the incident as an example of the unpredictable nature of human-wildlife interactions and the importance of understanding animal behavior for preventing similar tragedies. The attack became a case study used in training programs for law enforcement officers, corrections personnel, and wildlife managers throughout North America. The long-term psychological impact of the bear attack affected not only the direct victims, but also their families, fellow inmates, corrections personnel, and members of the broader community who had been touched by the tragedy. Post-traumatic stress disorder was diagnosed in several of the survivors, requiring ongoing counseling and treatment that would continue for years after their physical injuries had healed. Jennifer Vasquez, who had not been physically injured during the attack, experienced severe anxiety and panic attacks whenever she encountered any reminders of the incident. The sound of diesel engines, the sight of law enforcement officers, and even the orange color of prison uniforms could trigger flashbacks that left her emotionally devastated and unable to function normally. Thomas Kowalski found that the bear attack had paradoxically helped him cope with his depression and guilt over the deaths he had caused while driving under the influence. The immediate threat to his life had reminded him that existence itself was precious, even under the difficult circumstances of his incarceration, and he began participating more actively in rehabilitation programs and counseling sessions. Marcus Thompson used his experience during the bear attack as motivation for his continued participation in educational and vocational programs, recognizing that life could change dramatically without warning and that he needed to be prepared for whatever challenges awaited him upon his release from prison. His efforts to help his fellow inmates during the crisis had earned him respect from both prisoners and staff, leading to opportunities for leadership roles within the prison community. William Carver's experience during the bear attack had given him a new perspective on his own mortality and the consequences of his criminal actions. The realization that he could have died alongside the inmates he had previously tried to distance himself from had created a sense of common humanity that began to penetrate his defensive psychological barriers and allow him to acknowledge the harm he had caused his victims. Becca Torino continued her career with the Montana Department of Corrections, but requested a transfer away from transport duties due to the psychological trauma associated with the bear attack. Her quick thinking and professional response during the crisis had earned her commendations from her superiors, but the memory of watching her partner being dragged away by the bear continued to affect her ability to function effectively in similar situations. The Montana Department of Corrections implemented numerous changes to their transport protocols as a result of the bear attack investigation. New vehicles were equipped with reinforced doors and emergency communication systems, while transport officers received enhanced training in wildlife awareness and emergency response procedures. The department also established closer coordination with wildlife management agencies to ensure that transport routes avoided areas with known concentrations of dangerous animals during periods of increased activity. Trooper Daniel Martinez received recognition for his quick response to the emergency and his accurate rifle fire that ultimately stopped the bear's attack. His actions had undoubtedly saved lives and prevented additional injuries, though he continued to experience occasional nightmares about the incident and the sight of the massive predator attacking helpless human beings. The families of the attack victims established a support network that provided mutual assistance during the lengthy recovery and rehabilitation process that followed the incident. The shared experience of trauma created bonds between people who might never have met under other circumstances, demonstrating the human capacity for resilience and mutual support in the face of tragedy. 1 year after the bear attack, Martin Hayes had undergone 6 surgical procedures to repair his injuries and had begun the long process of physical rehabilitation that would continue for several more years. His left arm remained partially paralyzed, preventing his return to law enforcement duties, but his determination to recover and provide for his family inspired everyone involved in his treatment. Carl Rodriguez adapted to life with one arm while serving the remainder of his prison sentence, participating in vocational training programs that would prepare him for employment opportunities that accommodated his disability. His experience during the bear attack had given him a new perspective on life and the importance of making positive choices. leading to his participation in educational programs and mentoring activities with younger inmates. Bobby Sullivan completed his sentence and was released from prison 3 years after the bear attack, his permanent injuries serving as constant reminders of the incident, but not preventing him from rebuilding his life and finding employment in a modified construction role that accommodated his physical limitations. His participation in anger management and substance abuse programs during his incarceration had helped him address the underlying issues that had contributed to his criminal behavior. The location of the bear attack became an unofficial memorial site where travelers occasionally stopped to reflect on the tragedy and the unpredictable nature of life in Montana's wilderness areas. A small plaque installed by the Montana Department of Transportation marked the location and provided information about wildlife safety for motorists traveling through the area. Bear number G247's remains were studied extensively by wildlife biologists and veterinary pathologists who sought to understand the factors that had contributed to his unusual aggressive behavior. The research conducted on his tissue samples and behavioral history contributed to improved understanding of grizzly bear psychology and the development of better strategies for managing human-wildlife conflicts throughout North America. The legacy of the April 8, 2025 bear attack extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families to influence wildlife management policies, corrections procedures, and emergency response protocols throughout the region. The incident served as a stark reminder of the unpredictable dangers that could emerge from the intersection of human activities and natural systems, requiring constant vigilance and preparation for scenarios that seemed impossible until they actually occurred. The survivors of the attack, both victims and witnesses, carried with them memories that would last for the remainder of their lives, serving as permanent reminders of their mortality and the importance of appreciating each day of their existence. Their experiences during those terrifying 15 minutes on Highway 15 had forever changed their perspectives on life, death, and the fragile nature of human civilization in the face of nature's raw power. The Montana wilderness continued to harbor grizzly bears and other powerful predators whose lives occasionally intersected with human activities in ways that reminded people of their place in the natural order. The attack by bear number G247 represented one of the most dramatic and tragic examples of such interactions, but it served as an important lesson about the need for respect, preparation, and humility when venturing into territories that remained fundamentally wild despite centuries of human settlement and development. In the end, the bear attack of April 8, 2025 stood as a testament to both the destructive power of nature and the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable trauma. The victims who survived, the families who supported them, and the communities that rallied around them demonstrated that even the most horrific tragedies could not completely extinguish hope or the fundamental human capacity for recovery, growth, and mutual support in the face of adversity. The next stories. August 11th, 2024. Kodiak bear destroys ferry dock. 2 fishermen. Dead August 11th, 2024. Kodiak bear destroys ferry dock. 2 fishermen dead. The morning mist clung to Kodiak Island like a burial shroud, obscuring the tree line that bordered the ferry terminal in a grey veil that seemed to pulse with unseen menace. Brian Michael Ortega pulled his worn wool cap down against the chill as he guided the 30-foot commercial fishing vessel Sarah's Dream toward the main dock. The boat's twin diesel engines cutting through the dark waters of Chiniak Bay with the steady thrum that had carried him safely home from countless trips into the Gulf of Alaska's treacherous waters. The name on the stern honored his late daughter Sarah, who had died of leukemia at age 7, and every return to this dock carried with it the weight of that memory and the hope that another successful fishing trip would help pay down the medical bills that still haunted his family's finances 3 years later. "Weather's turning nasty," Samuel Theodore Holt observed from his position at the stern, his weathered hands already reaching for the thick, braided mooring lines coiled at his feet like sleeping serpents. At 62, Sam had been working these waters since he was 15 years old, longer than most men had been breathing, his sun-damaged face telling the story of 47 years spent hauling nets and dodging storms in some of the most unforgiving waters on Earth. The deep lines around his pale blue eyes, the same color as the ice fields he'd worked around in his younger days, crinkled as he squinted toward the dock through the morning gloom, something primal and instinctive making him pause in his practice preparations. His grandfather had been a commercial fisherman. His father had worked these same waters until emphysema from years of smoking finally claimed him, and Sam had planned to continue the family tradition until his own body gave out. He had no way of knowing that this morning would mark the end of the Holt family's century-long relationship with the sea. Brian Matthew Ortega, 28 years old and married to his high school sweetheart, Jennifer Ann Castellanos Ortega, felt the same inexplicable prickle of unease crawling up his spine like an ice-cold finger tracing his vertebrae. Born and raised in Kodiak, he had spent his entire adult life reading the subtle signs that spelled the difference between profit and disaster, between coming home to his family and becoming another name on the memorial plaque at the harbour master's office. His father had been a logger before the environmental regulations shut down most of the island's timber operations, and Brian had turned to the sea as the only viable way to support a family in one of America's most remote and expensive communities. The deep-sea fishing was dangerous work that claimed lives regularly, but it paid well enough to support Jennifer's work as a part-time substitute teacher and their modest home overlooking the bay. This morning, something felt different, felt wrong, in a way that made his hands sweat inside his insulated gloves despite the morning chill. The dock appeared completely deserted, which wasn't particularly unusual for a Sunday morning in late August, when most of the weekend recreational boaters were either sleeping off Saturday nights drinking or attending services at one of Kodiak's 3 churches. But there was something else present in the silence, a quality that felt fundamentally wrong to men who had spent their lives attuned to the rhythms of the ocean and its creatures. No seagulls wheeled overhead, crying their harsh demands for scraps from the fish hold. No harbour seals poked their whiskered faces above the surface to investigate their approach with the curiosity that had made them the unofficial greeters of returning fishing vessels. Even the water seemed unnaturally still, broken only by the Sarah's Dream's wake, spreading behind them in a perfect V-shaped pattern that disturbed the mirror-like surface of the bay. The Kodiak Island ferry terminal had served as the primary lifeline connecting the remote fishing community to the outside world for over 31 years. Its weathered Douglas fir pilings and reinforced concrete platforms standing as testament to the stubborn persistence of those who chose to make their living from the sea in one of the most isolated and challenging environments in North America. The main dock stretched exactly 212 feet into the bay, supported by massive posts, driven 18 feet into the seabed and reinforced with steel cables that normally sang in the wind like the strings of some enormous harp. The structure had been designed by marine engineer Robert David Chen to withstand the worst that Alaska's notoriously violent weather could throw at it, including 90-mile-per-hour winds and the crushing pressure of pack ice driven by winter storms. On this particular morning, however, those cables hung slack and ominously silent, and even the ever-present creaking of the wooden structure against its steel reinforcements had ceased entirely. "Something spooked all the wildlife," Sam muttered, his voice carrying the hard-earned authority of a man who had learned to trust his instincts above all else over nearly 5 decades of commercial fishing. He had survived 3 major storms that had claimed other vessels and their crews, 2 capsizings that had left him hypothermic and clinging to debris in water cold enough to kill a man in minutes, and a collision with a Coast Guard cutter during a fog bank so thick he couldn't see his own bow light. Each survival had been purchased with the knowledge that in Alaska's waters, complacency was a luxury that could kill you faster than equipment failure or bad weather. This morning, that familiar sensation of wrongness hung in the salt-tinged air like an accusation, like nature itself was trying to warn them away from something that no amount of experience could prepare them to face. Brian eased back on the throttle controls, allowing the 30-foot vessel to drift the final 50 yards to the dock under momentum alone, the way his father had taught him during his first fishing trips as a 12-year-old boy, desperate to prove himself worthy of following in the family tradition. The engine's deep rumble faded to a barely audible whisper, replaced by the gentle lap of small waves against the fiberglass hull and the almost inaudible creak of the vessel's frame, adjusting to the water's subtle motion. In the sudden relative quiet, both men became acutely aware of another sound that shouldn't have been there, or rather, the complete and total absence of sounds that should have filled the morning air around any functioning marine terminal. The silence was not just unusual, but absolute in a way that violated the natural order of things. No chattering red squirrels in the towering Sitka spruce trees, no rustle of small creatures moving through the dense understory of Devil's Club and salmonberry bushes, no bird song of any kind. The coastal temperate rainforest of Kodiak Island typically teemed with life even during the early morning hours when most creatures were just beginning their daily routines. But today the forest might as well have been a painted theatrical backdrop. The towering trees that formed a living wall behind the terminal building stood motionless despite the offshore breeze that should have set their branches swaying, their needles heavy with morning dew that caught the weak sunlight like thousands of tiny prisms. Even the tide pools that dotted the rocky shoreline beyond the dock, normally alive with the movement of crabs and sea anemones, appeared still and lifeless. "Brian," Sam's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, his weather-beaten hands tightening on the braided mooring line until his knuckles went white as old bone. "Cut the engine all the way off." Without question or hesitation, Brian reached forward and twisted the ignition key, plunging them into a silence so complete and unnatural that it seemed to have physical weight pressing down on the boat like a suffocating blanket. In that absolute quiet, they heard it clearly for the first time, a sound that reached back through millions of years of human evolution to trigger fears buried so deep in their DNA that their ancestors had carried them out of the caves and across continents. Heavy breathing. Rhythmic, powerful, and far too large and deep to belong to any human being who had ever drawn breath. The breathing came from somewhere in the shadows where the ancient forest met the concrete and steel of the terminal building, a sound like wind through a cavern, but with an organic quality that spoke of massive lungs processing enormous volumes of air. It was the sound of something so large that each breath represented the movement of air in quantities that would fill a small room. Each exhalation accompanied by the faintest rumble that seemed to vibrate through the water itself and up through the hull of their boat in barely perceptible vibrations that both men could feel in their bones. Brian's mouth went completely dry as the realization hit him like a physical blow. In his 15 years of commercial fishing in Alaska's most dangerous waters, he had encountered brown bears on shore more times than he cared to remember or discuss with his wife, who already worried constantly about the dangers he faced every time he left port. He knew the sound of a bear breathing from his hunting days as a teenager, when his father had taken him into the interior to hunt caribou and moose, but this was different in a way that defied rational explanation. This breathing belonged to something larger than any bear he had ever imagined, something so massive that its mere presence in the area could apparently empty an entire marine ecosystem of every other living thing, creating a zone of silence and fear that extended for hundreds of yards in every direction. Kodiak brown bears were already recognized as the largest land predators on Earth, with adult males routinely reaching weights that approached 1,500 pounds and standing over 10 feet tall when they reared up on their powerful hind legs. They were the unchallenged masters of their isolated island domain, apex predators that had evolved in splendid isolation for thousands of years into something more powerful and dangerous than their mainland cousins, feeding on the incredibly rich salmon runs and abundant marine life that made Kodiak Island a paradise for anything large enough and strong enough to claim its place at the top of the food chain. But even among Kodiak bears, there were legends passed down through generations of Alaska natives and commercial fishermen, stories about bears so large and aggressive that they transcended the boundaries between observable reality and the kind of nightmares that kept men awake at night. Creatures that existed somewhere in the grey area between documented natural history and the darkest corners of human imagination. The breathing stopped with an abruptness that was somehow more terrifying than the sound itself had been. In the sudden absence of that rhythmic, powerful sound, Brian and Sam found themselves involuntarily holding their own breath, straining to hear any indication of where the creature had gone, or what it might be doing in the concealing shadows of the forest. The Sarah's Dream continued to drift closer to the dock under her remaining momentum, her bow cutting silently through water so still it might have been black glass, carrying them inexorably toward the mooring posts, where they had tied off hundreds of times before without giving the routine procedure a second thought. "Maybe it moved on," Brian whispered, though even as the words left his mouth he didn't believe them himself, couldn't make himself believe them. Despite his desperate desire to think that whatever had been lurking in the forest had simply lost interest and wandered away in search of easier prey or different hunting grounds. Every survival instinct he had developed during 15 years of dangerous work in one of the world's most unforgiving environments screamed at him to start the engine immediately and back away from the dock as fast as the twin diesels could push them, to put as much distance as possible between them and whatever was lurking in those shadows. But they had 3,000 pounds of premium halibut and salmon in their hold, the result of 4 brutally hard days of dangerous work in the Gulf of Alaska's storm-tossed waters, and the catch represented not just their livelihood, but their ability to make mortgage payments, buy groceries, and keep the electricity turned on in homes where their families waited for them to return safely. Sam shook his grizzled head slowly, his pale eyes never leaving the dark line where forest met civilization, never stopping their systematic scan of the shadows for any hint of movement or threat. "It's still there, Brian. I can feel the damn thing watching us, studying us like we're specimens in a jar." The sensation of being observed was not just psychological but almost physical, like feeling the weight of invisible eyes pressing against exposed skin. Both men had experienced it before, during encounters with bears and wolves in the wilderness. That uncomfortable awareness that comes when a predator focuses its complete attention with the intensity and unwavering concentration of a laser beam locked onto its target. It was the same evolutionary response that made deer freeze in headlights and sent mice scurrying frantically for cover when hawks circled overhead. The recognition that something higher up on the food chain was making calculations about attack vectors and escape routes. The Sarah's Dream bumped gently against the dock's black rubber fenders with barely perceptible contact. The impact so soft it would normally have gone unnoticed, but somehow this morning it felt final and decisive, like the closing of a trap that had been carefully set and patiently waited. Brian reached automatically for the mooring line with movements practiced by thousands of repetitions, then stopped abruptly as Sam's hand clamped down on his wrist with surprising strength for a man his age. Don't tie off, Sam breathed, his voice tight with controlled fear. Keep the engine ready to start. Keep us ready to run. But even as Sam spoke the warning, they both knew it was already too late. The forest erupted. The bear that burst from the tree line was beyond anything either man had imagined possible, beyond anything that should have been able to exist in the modern world. Standing on its hind legs, it towered nearly 12 feet into the pale morning air, its massive bulk blocking out the weak sun like a total eclipse, casting a shadow that seemed to swallow the entire dock in premature darkness. Its coat was a rich, deep chocolate brown, so dark it appeared almost black in the dim light, and its head was proportioned like something from the Pleistocene era, when giant cave bears ruled the northern continents. Broad and powerful, with a distinctly dished face and small eyes that glittered with predatory intelligence and an unmistakable hunger for violence. This was no ordinary Kodiak bear, no normal representative of even the largest subspecies of brown bear on Earth. This was something that belonged in paleontology textbooks and natural history museums, a throwback to an earlier age when megafauna ruled the world and humans were nothing more than small, frightened primates hiding in trees. Its shoulders bulged with muscle that rippled beneath its dense fur with each movement, creating waves of power that spoke of strength beyond measurement, and its massive paws, each easily the size of a large dinner plate and armed with claws like curved railroad spikes, left deep gouges in the seasoned planking of the dock as it charged toward the water with a speed that seemed to defy the laws of physics for something so impossibly large. The bear's roar shattered the morning silence like a thunderclap amplified through the world's largest speakers, a sound so fundamentally primal and terrifying that it seemed to bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in the chest cavity, vibrating through bone and tissue with the force of a seismic event. It was the voice of apex predation given form, of overwhelming force unleashed after careful stalking and patient waiting, and it triggered an immediate, involuntary response in every living thing within a radius of several miles. Seabirds that had been resting invisibly in hidden roosts erupted into the air in screaming, panicked clouds that darkened the sky, while throughout the forest, smaller creatures burrowed deeper into their hiding places or fled toward whatever safety they could find, creating a wave of panic that rippled outward from the terminal like the shock wave from an explosion. Brian's hand flew to the ignition key with movements made clumsy by terror and adrenaline, but the bear was already at the dock's edge, its massive weight causing the entire structure to vibrate like a struck tuning fork, the steel cables that anchored it to the seabed singing with tension as they absorbed and distributed forces they had never been designed to handle. With one casual swipe of its tremendous right forepaw, moving with the fluid grace of a creature completely comfortable with its own immense power, it shattered a piling that had stood for 3 decades, sending splinters of Douglas fir flying through the air like wooden shrapnel, some pieces large enough to kill a man if they struck with sufficient force. "Jesus Christ Almighty!" Sam shouted, his voice cracking with terror as he dropped the mooring line and scrambled toward the boat's center, his sea boots slipping on the wet deck as the bear dropped to all fours and charged onto the dock proper. The wooden structure, engineered and built to support the weight of loaded trucks and emergency vehicles, groaned and cracked ominously under the strain of nearly 2,000 pounds of enraged apex predator, moving at a speed that would have been impressive for a racehorse, much less something the size of a small automobile. The bear's charge carried it halfway down the 200-foot dock before it stopped abruptly, rearing up on its hind legs again to survey the fishing vessel that bobbed just beyond its immediate reach. From this shorter distance, Brian could see details that would haunt whatever remained of his life. The bear's eyes, small and dark and filled with an intelligence that was disturbingly human in its calculation and patience. The pink interior of its mouth as it roared again, revealing teeth designed by millions of years of evolution for crushing bones and tearing flesh from struggling prey, and the raw, awesome power contained in its shoulders and forearms as it dropped back to all fours and approached the dock's edge with the deliberate, measured purpose of a predator that had never known defeat. "Start the engine," Sam screamed, his voice barely audible over the sound of his own heart pounding in his ears. But Brian was already turning the key, the twin diesel engines coughing reluctantly to life just as the bear reached the end of the dock and stopped to study them with the patient attention of a creature that had never known fear, never experienced doubt about its position at the absolute top of the food chain. For a moment that stretched like hours, the three beings, two terrified humans and one massive predator, faced each other across 12 feet of dark water that suddenly seemed as narrow and insignificant as a small stream that could be crossed in a single bound. The bear studied them with the infinite patience of something that had lived long enough to reach its impossible size by never making hasty decisions, never rushing into situations where patience and calculation might serve better than immediate action. Its breathing had returned to that slow, powerful rhythm they had heard earlier, each exhalation clearly visible in the cool morning air as small puffs of vapor that dissipated slowly in the still atmosphere like signals of its continued presence and predatory intent. Brian threw the transmission into reverse, the twin propellers churning water frantically as he attempted to back away from the dock. But the bear had already made its decision with the swift certainty of a predator that had successfully hunted for decades. With a fluidity and grace that completely belied its massive size and weight, the creature dove from the dock into the bay, hitting the water with a tremendous splash that sent waves rolling toward shore and rocked the Sarah's Dream violently in the sudden turbulence. Kodiak brown bears were known to be powerful swimmers, capable of covering vast distances in the frigid ocean waters that surrounded their island home. But seeing this monster bear slice through the water with the efficiency and speed of a torpedo was still a shock that left both men momentarily paralyzed with disbelief. Its massive head stayed well above the surface, dark eyes locked on the Sarah's Dream with unwavering focus, while its powerful limbs propelled it through the water at a speed that made any thought of escape completely impossible. The bear reached their boat in a matter of seconds, its massive forepaws slamming against the fiberglass hull, with sounds like gunshots echoing across the bay. The Sarah's Dream lurched violently to port as nearly a ton of muscle and bone hauled itself partially out of the water, its claws finding purchase on the aluminum gunnel and leaving deep scratches in the metal that would serve as permanent reminders of this encounter for anyone who survived to see them. Sam scrambled across the wet deck, his boots slipping dangerously on the non-skid surface as he reached desperately for the emergency flare gun mounted in a bracket near the wheelhouse. His hands shook uncontrollably as he broke open the device and fumbled for a cartridge, but the bear was already pulling itself higher out of the water with the inexorable determination of a force of nature, its massive head and shoulders rising above the boat's rail like some primordial nightmare emerging from the depths of the ocean itself. The smell hit them then with the force of a physical blow. A combination of wet fur, rotting fish, and something else, something wild and fundamentally predatory that spoke directly to the most primitive parts of their brains about death and consumption, and the brutal reality of their position in the natural order. It was the smell of a creature that had killed recently and would kill again as naturally and inevitably as the tide. A scent that carried with it the accumulated violence of thousands of successful hunts spanning decades of predatory dominance. Brian gunned both engines simultaneously, hoping desperately to shake the bear loose through sudden acceleration, but the creature's grip was far too strong, its claws embedded too deeply in the boat's structure to be dislodged by mere mechanical force. Instead, The sudden forward momentum caused the boat to lurch ahead while listing dangerously to port, and the bear, rather than being thrown clear, simply pulled itself higher onto the deck with a fluid motion that demonstrated its complete comfort and expertise in aquatic environments. Sam raised the flare gun with both hands, his finger finding the trigger mechanism just as the bear's massive head swung toward him with predatory focus. The emergency flare burst from the barrel in a streak of brilliant red fire, striking the bear squarely in the chest and exploding in a spectacular shower of sparks, flame, and burning chemical residue that lit up the morning gloom like a miniature sun. The bear roared in pain and fury, a sound so loud and primal it seemed to physically shake the boat itself, rattling equipment and causing both men's ears to ring with painful intensity. But rather than retreating from this unexpected assault, the creature lunged forward with surprising speed and accuracy, its massive right forepaw striking Sam squarely in the chest with enough force to lift him completely off his feet and send him flying backward across the deck, to crash against the aluminum wheelhouse with a sickening thud that spoke eloquently of broken ribs, internal injuries, and possibly worse damage that wouldn't be apparent until much later, if there was going to be a later. Brian spun the wheel hard to starboard, attempting to throw the bear off balance through sudden course changes. But the creature adapted instantly to the boat's motion, its claws digging even deeper into the fiberglass hull as it pulled its full weight onto the vessel with movements that demonstrated perfect balance and coordination, despite its enormous size. The Sarah's Dream listed dangerously to port under the incredible load, cold seawater beginning to slosh ominously over the low-side rail and onto the deck, threatening the stability of the entire vessel. Sam lay crumpled against the wheelhouse like a broken doll, blood flowing steadily from his mouth and nose, painting the white aluminum with bright red streaks that looked almost artistic in their random patterns. But his eyes were still alert and aware, still fighting, still looking for some way to help his younger partner survive what was rapidly becoming a hopeless situation. With tremendous effort and obvious pain, he raised his head slightly and looked toward the marine radio mounted near Brian's position at the helm. "Mayday," he whispered, though his voice was far too weak to carry over the engine noise and the bear's continued vocalizations. Blood flecked his lips as he tried again, summoning strength from reserves he didn't know he still possessed. "Call Mayday, Brian." The bear had fully boarded the vessel now, its massive bulk taking up most of the available deck space and fundamentally altering the boat's center of gravity in ways that threatened its basic stability. At this close range, its size was not just impressive, but overwhelming in a way that challenged rational thought. Shoulders as broad as a doorframe, a head the size of a beer keg, and muscles that rolled and shifted beneath its dense fur like steel cables under extreme tension. This was evolution's most perfect predator, refined over millions of years of natural selection into a killing machine that could crush a seal's skull with a single bite or decapitate a full-grown caribou with one casual swipe of its massive paw. Brian abandoned the wheel entirely and grabbed for the radio microphone, his voice cracking with terror and disbelief as he keyed the transmitter with hands that shook so badly he could barely operate the simple controls. "Mayday! Mayday! This is fishing vessel Sarah's Dream. We have a bear attack in progress at the Kodiak Ferry Terminal. We need immediate assistance. Repeat, we have a massive bear on board and need immediate emergency assistance." The bear's attention focused on the sound of Brian's voice with laser-like intensity, its small dark eyes tracking to his position with the precision of a guided missile locking onto its target. It took one deliberate step forward, its massive paw leaving a deep impression in the boat's non-skid deck surface. Then another, closing the distance between predator and prey with the patience of something that knew the outcome was inevitable. Brian could see his own reflection in the creature's dark eyes, distorted and small, could smell its breath, hot and rank, with the unmistakable scent of recent kills and raw meat. The bear's head was so large that it blocked out most of his field of vision, creating a claustrophobic sensation of being trapped in a tunnel with no exit and no hope of escape. From his position against the wheelhouse, Sam summoned what he knew must be the last of his strength and pulled himself slowly to his feet, his movements careful and deliberate, despite injuries that should have kept him down permanently. In his right hand, he clutched a steel fish gaff, 4 feet of aircraft-grade aluminum handle topped with a razor-sharp steel hook designed for landing large Pacific halibut that could weigh several hundred pounds and fight with desperate strength when brought to the surface. "Hey!" Sam shouted, his voice somehow stronger than it had any right to be given his obvious injuries. "Hey, you son of a bitch! Look at me!" The bear turned toward this new threat with fluid grace, and Sam drove the gaff forward, with every ounce of strength remaining in his battered body, the sharp point penetrating the bear's thick fur and dense muscle to find flesh beneath. The creature roared in genuine pain and swung a massive paw in retaliation, the impact catching Sam across the side of the head with enough force to snap his neck and lift him completely off his feet, sending his body over the boat's rail to splash into the dark water below, where it immediately began to sink beneath the surface. "Sam!" Brian screamed, but his friend and fishing partner of 8 years had already disappeared beneath the waves, leaving only expanding ripples and a slowly spreading stain of red on the water to mark where he had gone under, probably already dead from the crushing blow that had ended his decades of survival in one of the world's most dangerous occupations. The bear, now bleeding from the gaff wound but showing no signs of being significantly weakened or discouraged by the injury, turned its complete attention back to Brian with renewed focus and what might have been increased aggression. There was nowhere to run on the small fishing boat. Nowhere to hide from a predator that could tear through the aluminum and fiberglass construction like tissue paper. No weapon within reach that could possibly stop something this large and powerful and determined. Brian pressed himself against the stern rail, the cold metal digging into his back through his heavy jacket, and found himself staring death directly in the face for what he was certain would be the final time. The creature approached slowly, almost casually, as if savoring the moment and the fear it could sense radiating from its trapped prey. Its breathing had returned to that slow, powerful rhythm that seemed to mark time like a countdown clock, each exhalation bringing it closer to the moment when the hunt would end in the only way such encounters ever ended in the natural world. Brian's hand found the emergency beacon clipped to his life vest, and he activated it with a quick, desperate pull of the lanyard, knowing it was almost certainly too late but unable to give up completely while any hope remained. The device began transmitting immediately, sending out an automated distress signal that included their GPS coordinates, vessel identification, and emergency status to Coast Guard monitoring stations throughout Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. It was a final, desperate act, a message in a bottle cast into electronic seas, in the slim hope that someone, somewhere, might respond quickly enough to matter. The bear was close enough now that Brian could see individual guard hairs in its coat, could count the old scars that marked its massive muzzle from decades of battles with other bears, rival predators, and probably human hunters who had been unfortunate enough to encounter it in the wilderness. This was clearly an old bear, a survivor, something that had lived long enough to reach a size that bordered on the physically impossible by being more cunning, more aggressive, and more successful than any of its contemporaries. Then, without any warning whatsoever, the bear lunged forward with explosive speed. Brian threw himself sideways with every ounce of athletic ability he possessed, feeling the wind displacement from the creature's massive paw as it swept through the space where his head had been positioned just a split second before. He rolled across the wet deck and came up near the boat's center, his hands instinctively finding the handles of a heavy tackle box, filled with hooks, sinkers, and other metal fishing gear that might serve as improvised weapons. The bear spun around with surprising grace and fluidity for something so massive, its small eyes never losing track of its prey for even a moment. It had clearly played this deadly game many times before, had cornered countless victims on ice floes and rocky beaches throughout its long and violent life. The creature understood the mathematics of predation with the expertise of a doctoral-level specialist. Sooner or later, the prey would make a mistake, would move in the wrong direction or hesitate a moment too long, and when that happened, the hunt would end with swift and brutal finality. Brian hurled the tackle box with both hands, using every ounce of strength in his shoulders and arms, the heavy container striking the bear squarely in the face and bursting open in a shower of metal hooks, lead sinkers, and steel swivels. The bear shook its massive head, more annoyed than injured by the improvised assault, and continued its methodical advance across the small deck. The marine radio suddenly crackled to life, a calm, professional voice breaking through the static with the unmistakable authority of the United States Coast Guard. Fishing vessel, Sarah's Dream. This is Coast Guard Station Kodiak. We have received your Mayday call and emergency beacon activation. Please state the exact nature of your distress and your current condition. Brian lunged desperately for the microphone, but the bear was faster, its massive forepaw slamming down on the radio equipment and crushing it completely in a shower of sparks, broken plastic, and twisted metal components. The connection was severed instantly, leaving only the static hiss of a dead channel and the crushing realization that his last link to potential rescue had been eliminated with casual, almost contemptuous ease. Now there was only silence broken by the bear's powerful breathing and the gentle lapping of small waves against the hull of a boat that was rapidly becoming a floating tomb. The creature had systematically cut off every avenue of escape, had isolated Brian as effectively as if they were floating alone in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, thousands of miles from any hope of assistance. It was just the two of them now. Predator and prey, locked in an encounter as old as life itself, with an outcome that had been predetermined by millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Brian backed against the stern rail once again, his mind racing frantically through options that all seemed to lead to the same inevitable conclusion. The bear was positioned between him and any possible escape route, too large and powerful to fight effectively, too intelligent to be fooled by tricks or deception. His only remaining choice was the water, but even that offered little realistic hope for survival. If Sam, an experienced swimmer who had survived 2 previous capsizings and knew these waters better than anyone, couldn't make it to shore from this position, what chance did a younger but less experienced man have in water cold enough to cause hypothermia in minutes? The bear seemed to sense his resignation and growing despair, its approach becoming more confident and assured. It reared up on its powerful hind legs one final time, towering above the small fishing boat like a monument to predatory perfection and the brutal realities of the natural world, then dropped back to all fours and took the final steps that brought it within easy striking distance of its trapped prey. Brian closed his eyes and thought of his wife Jennifer, probably still asleep in their small house overlooking the bay, unaware that she was about to become a widow at the age of 26. She would wake in a few hours expecting him to be unloading their catch at the processing plant, would pour his coffee and ask about the fishing trip and whether they had encountered any problems with weather or equipment. By then, Coast Guard cutters would already be racing toward these coordinates, searching the dark waters for debris, oil slicks, and whatever remained of the Sarah's Dream and her crew. The bear's breathing stopped again with that same abruptness that had marked the beginning of this nightmare, and Brian knew with absolute certainty that this was the moment of truth. He opened his eyes and looked directly into the creature's face, meeting its predatory gaze with whatever courage remained to him. If he was going to die in the next few seconds, he would die looking at his killer, not cowering with his eyes closed like a frightened child. But instead of the final crushing blow he expected and had prepared himself to receive, the bear tilted its massive head slightly to one side, as if listening to something beyond the range of human hearing. Its small, rounded ears, almost comically undersized for its enormous head, swiveled forward with obvious alertness, focusing intently on a sound that grew stronger and more distinct with each passing second. The helicopter appeared over the tree line like salvation itself, its rotor wash immediately flattening the water around the Sarah's Dream and filling the morning air with spray and the thunderous sound of rotors beating against the thick atmosphere. It was a United States Coast Guard MH-65 Dolphin, painted in the distinctive international orange and white colors that had come to symbolize rescue and hope throughout Alaska's far-flung maritime communities. And through its plexiglass windows, Brian could clearly see the faces of the rescue crew as they took in the incredible scene unfolding on the water below. The bear looked up at this new arrival with what could only be described as curiosity rather than fear, its attention now divided between Brian and the aircraft that hovered approximately 50 feet overhead like some mechanical angel of mercy. The creature showed no signs of panic or desire to flee, as if it had never encountered anything in its long life that posed a genuine threat to its continued existence and dominance. A voice boomed down from powerful speakers mounted on the helicopter's belly, the words clear and authoritative despite the noise from the rotors. "This is the United States Coast Guard. Do not move. Remain calm and motionless. We are preparing to deploy rescue swimmers." The bear looked back at Brian, then up at the helicopter again, seeming to weigh its options with the same careful calculation it had demonstrated throughout this encounter. For a long, tense moment that seemed to stretch indefinitely, the three elements of this surreal tableau remained frozen in place: the massive predator, the terrified human, and the hovering aircraft with its crew of highly trained rescuers who had probably never encountered anything quite like this situation in all their years of emergency response work. Then the bear made its final decision. With one last roar that seemed to shake the very air itself and could probably be heard for miles in every direction, it turned away from Brian and dove over the boat's side, hitting the water with a tremendous splash that rocked the Sarah's Dream violently and sent waves radiating outward in all directions. Brian watched in amazement and profound relief as the creature's massive form cut through the bay with powerful, efficient strokes, heading not toward the shore where it might take cover in the forest, but toward the deeper water of the main channel, as if it understood instinctively that the arrival of the helicopter meant the end of the hunt and the beginning of a new phase in this deadly encounter. Coast Guard rescue swimmer Petty Officer First Class Maria Elena Santos hit the water exactly 30 seconds later, her bright orange dry suit clearly visible even in the grey morning light, as she swam toward the damaged fishing vessel with powerful, practiced strokes. At 28 years old, Santos had completed over 200 successful rescues during her 6-year career with the Coast Guard, but she had never been deployed to assist victims of a bear attack, and the sight of the damage to the Sarah's Dream's hull and deck told her immediately that this was unlike anything in her previous experience. She hauled herself aboard with the practiced efficiency of someone who had performed this maneuver hundreds of times in conditions ranging from calm seas to hurricane-force winds, her eyes immediately scanning the boat for signs of additional victims and assessing Brian's condition for obvious injuries. "Where is the other person?" she shouted over the helicopter's rotor noise, having to raise her voice to be heard above the thunderous sound of the aircraft maintaining its hover overhead. The emergency call mentioned 2 people on board. In the water, Brian managed to reply, his voice barely audible and hoarse from screaming. "Sam's in the water somewhere. The bear got him, threw him overboard. Sam Holt. He's been fishing these waters for almost 50 years. Santos immediately keyed her waterproof radio, her training taking over as she followed established protocols for water recovery situations. Rescue 1, we have a person in the water. Identity confirmed as Samuel Holt, possibly injured and requiring immediate medical attention. Request immediate expansion of search pattern to include full swimmer recovery operations." The helicopter moved away from the damaged fishing boat, its highly trained crew beginning the systematic grid search that would continue for the next 6.5 hours, covering over 40 square miles of ocean and coastline. They would eventually locate Sam Holt's body washed up on a small rocky beach approximately 2 miles southeast of the ferry terminal, his bright orange life vest still properly inflated, but his injuries far too severe for any rescue efforts to have made a difference, even if they had been able to reach him within minutes of his entry into the water. As Santos helped Brian secure his safety harness and prepared him for extraction to the helicopter hovering overhead, he looked back toward the ferry dock one final time and saw the full extent of the damage the bear had inflicted during its brief but incredibly violent encounter with human civilization. 3 of the massive Douglas fir pilings that had supported the dock for over 3 decades were completely destroyed, their splintered remains jutting from the dark water like broken teeth, while several more showed deep gouges and cracks that would require immediate replacement before the structure could be considered safe for normal operations. The dock's surface was scarred with deep furrows from the creature's claws, gouges in the seasoned planking that were so deep they had actually penetrated completely through the 4-inch thick boards in several places. Several sections of the heavy-duty metal railings designed to prevent vehicles from accidentally driving off the dock had been twisted and bent beyond recognition, shaped into abstract sculptures by forces that defied easy calculation. The Coast Guard would later estimate the total damage at just over $300,000, forcing the complete closure of the Kodiak Island ferry terminal for 23 days, while specialized marine construction crews worked around the clock to rebuild the critical infrastructure that connected the remote fishing community to the outside world. During that period, all ferry service to and from the island was suspended, forcing residents to rely on expensive air cargo services for essential supplies, and creating economic hardship for businesses that depended on regular shipments of goods and materials. But for Brian Michael Ortega, suspended in a rescue basket 50 feet above the waters, where his friend and fishing partner of 8 years had died in such a sudden and violent manner, the true cost of this encounter could never be measured in dollars or calculated by insurance adjusters. The physical damage to boats and docks could be repaired with sufficient time and money, but the psychological wounds would prove far more persistent and difficult to heal. As the helicopter carried him toward Kodiak Regional Medical Center for evaluation and treatment of his injuries, Brian found himself staring down at the dark water of Chiniak Bay, searching desperately for any sign of Sam's body or debris from their encounter with something that shouldn't have existed in the modern world. The water revealed nothing, keeping its secrets with the same indifference it had shown to thousands of other tragedies throughout Alaska's violent maritime history. The rescue helicopter touched down on the hospital's landing pad at exactly 8:47 a.m., where a full trauma team led by Dr. Rebecca Ann Martinez was waiting to receive Brian and begin the process of treating both his physical injuries and the psychological trauma that was already beginning to manifest in the form of uncontrollable shaking and difficulty forming coherent sentences. Dr. Martinez, who had been practicing emergency medicine in Alaska for 12 years, had treated victims of numerous bear attacks, but never anything quite like this. Patient is a 28-year-old commercial fisherman conscious and alert, suffering from acute trauma following a bear attack on his fishing vessel, Petty Officer Santos reported as they transferred Brian to the gurney. One fatality confirmed: victim's fishing partner was killed during the attack. Patient shows signs of severe psychological shock, but no obvious physical injuries. Dr. Martinez began her examination immediately, checking Brian's vital signs and looking for any injuries that might not be immediately apparent. His heart rate was elevated to nearly 140 beats per minute, his blood pressure dangerously high, and he was showing classic symptoms of acute stress reaction, including trembling, rapid breathing, and an inability to focus on simple questions. "Mr. Ortega, can you tell me what happened out there?" Dr. Martinez asked gently as nurses began attaching monitoring equipment. "Take your time. There's no rush." Brian's account of the attack would be recorded and transcribed, becoming part of an official incident report that would eventually make its way to Alaska Department of Fish and Game biologists, Coast Guard investigators, and federal wildlife management agencies. But even in his traumatized state, Brian was able to provide details that painted a picture of an encounter with something far outside the normal parameters of documented bear behavior. "It wasn't just big," he repeated several times during his initial statement. "It was impossible. Bears don't get that big. They don't act like that. It was like it was hunting us specifically, like it had been waiting for us to show up. And the way it moved in the water, I've never seen anything like it." Meanwhile, Coast Guard Station Kodiak had launched a full-scale investigation into the incident, led by Chief Petty Officer James Robert Thompson, a 20-year veteran of search and rescue operations who had been involved in hundreds of marine emergencies but had never encountered anything quite like this situation. The initial evidence collection would take 3 days and involve multiple agencies, including the Alaska State Troopers, the National Park Service, and specialists from the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. The most disturbing aspect of the investigation was the complete absence of any normal explanation for what had occurred. Chief Thompson had dealt with numerous bear encounters over his career, but they typically involved bears that had wandered into populated areas in search of food, or fishing boats that had accidentally disturbed bears feeding along the shoreline. Bears simply did not stalk and attack vessels in open water, and they certainly didn't demonstrate the kind of calculated, purposeful behavior that Brian had described. "In 20 years of Coast Guard service in Alaska, I have never encountered or even heard reports of behavior like this," Chief Thompson would later write in his official report. "The incident appears to represent an unprecedented level of aggressive behavior by what witnesses describe as an exceptionally large brown bear, possibly suffering from some form of neurological condition or disease that altered its normal behavioral patterns." The search for Sam Holt's body involved 3 Coast Guard cutters, 2 helicopters, and a specialized dive team from Anchorage. The operation covered over 40 square miles of ocean and coastline before his body was finally discovered on a small beach, accessible only by boat or helicopter. The condition of the remains confirmed Brian's account of the violent nature of the attack. Sam had died almost instantly from massive trauma to the head and neck, injuries consistent with a blow from something with enormous strength and power. Dr. Sarah Elizabeth Mackenzie, a wildlife biologist who had spent over 23 years studying Kodiak brown bears, was called in to provide expert analysis of the incident. Her initial reaction was one of professional skepticism. The behavior described by Brian Ortega was so far outside the normal range of documented bear behavior that her first assumption was that trauma and shock had distorted his perceptions and memory of the events. But the physical evidence told a different story. The damage to the ferry dock required forces that could only have been generated by something of extraordinary size and strength, and the claw marks gouged into the boat's fiberglass hull were too large and too deep to have been made by even the largest documented Kodiak bears. When Dr. Mackenzie examined plaster casts made of the paw prints left on the dock's wooden surface, she found herself confronting evidence that challenged everything she thought she knew about the upper size limits of North American brown bears. The paw prints measure 14 inches in length and 11 inches in width, with claw marks extending an additional 4 inches beyond the toe pads, she wrote in her preliminary report. These measurements are approximately 30% larger than anything in our extensive database of Kodiak bear tracks, suggesting an animal of unprecedented size and weight. Using established formulas for estimating bear size based on track measurements, Dr. Mackenzie calculated that the creature responsible for the attack would have weighed between 1,800 and 2,000 pounds, with a standing height of approximately 12 feet. Dimensions that placed it well outside the documented size range for modern brown bears and into the realm of extinct Pleistocene megafauna. The media response to the incident was immediate and intense, with news organizations from around the world sending reporters and camera crews to Kodiak Island to cover what quickly became known as the monster bear attack. The story captured international attention partly because of its dramatic nature, but also because it raised disturbing questions about what might be lurking in Alaska's vast wilderness areas that remained largely unexplored and undocumented. Television news crews interviewed Brian Ortega repeatedly during his recovery, though his accounts remained consistent despite intense questioning, designed to uncover inconsistencies or exaggerations. His description of the bear's size, behavior, and apparent intelligence never wavered, even when faced with skeptical reporters who suggested that trauma might have distorted his perceptions. "I know what I saw," Brian told CNN correspondent Lisa Park during a widely broadcast interview. "I've been fishing in Alaska for 15 years. I've seen hundreds of bears. This wasn't just a big bear. This was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist in the modern world. It was like looking at a dinosaur, something from another time that had somehow survived until now." The economic impact of the dock closure extended far beyond the immediate costs of repairs and reconstruction. The Kodiak Island ferry terminal served not only the local fishing fleet, but also the Alaska Marine Highway system, which provided essential transportation links for residents and businesses throughout the region. The 3-week closure disrupted supply chains, forced the cancellation of hundreds of passenger reservations, and created significant hardship for businesses that depended on regular ferry service. Local business owner Patricia Ann Kowalski, who operated a fishing supply store near the terminal, estimated that the closure cost her business over $20,000 in lost revenue during what should have been one of the busiest periods of the fishing season. "It wasn't just the immediate loss of customers," she explained. "The whole incident made people nervous about working around the dock area, even after it reopened. Fishermen were talking about arming themselves, carrying rifles on their boats, which is something you just don't see much in this community." The psychological impact on the local fishing community was significant and long-lasting. Many commercial fishermen who had worked these waters for decades found themselves reluctant to approach the ferry terminal, especially during early morning hours when visibility was limited. Several fishing operations relocated to alternative docking facilities, despite the additional costs and inconvenience involved, simply to avoid the area where the attack had occurred. Brian Ortega's recovery was complicated by severe post-traumatic stress disorder that manifested in nightmares, panic attacks, and an inability to return to commercial fishing. The man who had spent 15 years making his living from the sea found himself unable to board a boat without experiencing overwhelming anxiety and flashbacks to the morning when his world had changed forever. "I wake up every night seeing Sam go over the rail," Brian told his therapist during one of their sessions. I hear that roar. I smell that thing's breath. People keep asking me if I'm sure about what I saw, if maybe I'm exaggerating because of the shock, but I know exactly what happened out there. That bear was hunting us, stalking us like we were just another species of prey. Jennifer Ortega, Brian's wife, found herself thrust into the role of primary breadwinner while her husband struggled with recovery and rehabilitation. Her part-time teaching job barely covered their basic expenses, and the medical bills from Brian's treatment quickly exhausted their modest savings. The couple was forced to sell their home overlooking the bay and move into a small apartment, a transition that added financial stress to the emotional trauma they were already dealing with. The hardest part is watching Brian struggle with something that most people can't even begin to understand, Jennifer said during an interview with Alaska Public Radio. He's always been the strongest person I know, someone who could handle anything the ocean threw at him. But this thing, whatever it was, it broke something inside him that I'm not sure can ever be fully repaired. The official investigation continued for months, with teams of specialists examining every aspect of the incident in an attempt to understand what had occurred and whether similar attacks might be possible in the future. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game implemented new protocols for reporting unusual bear encounters, while the Coast Guard revised its emergency response procedures to include specific guidelines for dealing with large predator attacks in marine environments. Despite extensive searches by both ground teams and aircraft equipped with thermal imaging equipment, no trace of the massive bear was ever found. The creature seemed to have vanished into the vast wilderness of Kodiak Island as completely as if it had never existed, leaving behind only damaged infrastructure, traumatized survivors, and questions that might never be answered. Dr. Mackenzie's final report, submitted 6 months after the incident, concluded that the attack represented an unprecedented encounter with a brown bear of exceptional size and aggressive behavior, possibly representing either a rare genetic mutation or an unknown subspecies that has remained hidden in remote areas of the island. Her recommendations included increased monitoring of bear populations, enhanced safety protocols for maritime workers, and continued research into the possibility that isolated populations of unusually large bears might exist in Alaska's most remote wilderness areas. The rebuilt ferry terminal reopened with enhanced security measures including motion-activated lighting, emergency communication systems, and protocols requiring dock workers to maintain radio contact with shore-based personnel at all times. But despite these precautions, many fishermen continued to report an uneasy feeling when working around the facility, particularly during early morning hours when fog limited visibility. Sam Holt was laid to rest in the Kodiak Cemetery on a hilltop overlooking the bay, where he had spent most of his adult life earning a living from the sea. His funeral was attended by over 400 people, commercial fishermen, Coast Guard personnel, and townspeople who had known him as a skilled boat captain, devoted family man, and pillar of the local maritime community. His widow, Margaret Louise Holt, established the Samuel T. Holt Memorial Fund for Maritime Safety, which would eventually provide funding for emergency equipment and safety training programs throughout Alaska's fishing industry. Sam died doing what he loved, working on the water that had been his life for almost 50 years, Margaret said during the funeral service, but he also died protecting a younger man, fighting something that shouldn't have existed, and that's the kind of man he was, always willing to stand up when others needed help, even when it meant risking everything. The Sarah's Dream was repaired and returned to service, though Brian eventually sold the vessel to a fisherman from Homer, who had never heard the story of what happened at the ferry terminal. The new owner, Michael David Chen, renamed the boat Second Wind, and continues to work the same waters where Brian and Sam encountered their nightmare, though he has never experienced anything more threatening than rough weather and equipment failures. Brian Ortega never returned to commercial fishing. After 18 months of therapy and rehabilitation, he found work as a safety inspector for the Alaska Department of Labor, a job that allowed him to contribute to maritime safety without requiring him to spend extended periods on the water. The career change represented a significant reduction in income, but it provided the stability and predictability that his damaged psyche required for continued recovery. Some people think I should just get over it, go back to fishing like nothing happened, Brian said during a follow-up interview 2 years after the attack. But they didn't see what I saw out there. They didn't watch their best friend get killed by something that shouldn't exist. I know that thing is still out there somewhere, and I know that someday someone else is going to encounter it. When that happens, maybe people will finally understand that there are things in Alaska's wilderness that we don't know about, things that our science hasn't discovered or documented. The rebuilt dock has operated without major incidents for over 2 years now, but reports continue to filter in from other parts of Kodiak Island. Massive tracks found on remote beaches, fishing boats discovered damaged and abandoned in hidden coves, and occasional sightings by hunters and hikers of something moving through the forest that was too large to be any known species of wildlife. Dr. Mackenzie continues her research into the possibility of unknown bear populations existing in Alaska's most remote areas. Using satellite imagery and DNA analysis of hair samples collected from scratching trees and den sites throughout the island. Her work has identified several locations where unusually large tracks and other signs suggest the presence of bears significantly larger than any previously documented, but direct encounters remain elusive. The incident at the ferry terminal represents a significant gap in our understanding of Alaska's large predator populations, Dr. Mackenzie wrote in a recent research paper. The possibility that isolated populations of exceptionally large bears exist in remote areas cannot be dismissed based on current evidence, and continued research may eventually provide answers to questions raised by this unprecedented attack. Coast Guard personnel continue to train for unusual emergency scenarios, including protocols for dealing with large predator attacks in marine environments. The incident has become a case study taught at the Coast Guard Academy, used to illustrate the importance of maintaining flexibility and adaptability when responding to situations that fall outside normal parameters of emergency response. Chief Petty Officer Thompson, who led the initial investigation, has since been promoted and transferred to Coast Guard headquarters in Washington, D.C., where he helps develop policy and procedures for search and rescue operations throughout the United States. He still maintains that the Kodiak incident represents the most unusual and challenging case of his 25-year career. In all my years of emergency response work, I've never encountered anything that challenged our understanding of what's possible quite like this incident, Thompson said during a recent interview. It forced us to expand our thinking about the kinds of situations we might be called upon to handle, and it reminded us that Alaska's wilderness still holds secrets that we're only beginning to understand. The creature that locals have dubbed the Kodiak Monster has become part of regional folklore, joining the ranks of legendary Alaska predators like the glacier bear of Admiralty Island and the giant brown bears of the Alaska Peninsula. But for those who lived through the events of August 11th, 2024, it remains something more concrete and immediate than folklore. A reminder that in Alaska's vast wilderness, humans are always just one encounter away from discovering that they are not and never have been the apex predators they believed themselves to be. Local fishing guide Captain Robert Bobby Martinez, who operates charter trips throughout the Kodiak area, reports that clients frequently ask about the monster bear incident and whether similar creatures might still be lurking in the island's remote areas. "It's changed the way people think about this place," Martinez explains. "Used to be, people came here thinking Alaska was mostly tamed, mostly safe as long as you followed basic precautions. Now they understand that we're still living on the edge of the unknown." The economic impact of the incident extended beyond the immediate costs of dock repairs and ferry service disruptions. Tourism to Kodiak Island actually increased following media coverage of the attack, with visitors drawn by the possibility of encountering Alaska's legendary wildlife, though most hoped to observe bears from a safe distance rather than experience the kind of close encounter that had proved so traumatic for Brian and fatal for Sam. Adventure tourism companies began offering monster bear expeditions, despite criticism from local residents who felt the commercialization of the tragic incident was inappropriate and disrespectful to Sam Holt's memory. These tours, which combine bear viewing with visits to the rebuilt ferry terminal, have become popular with visitors from around the world who are fascinated by the story of the unprecedented attack. Environmental groups have used the incident to argue for expanded protection of Kodiak Island's wilderness areas, suggesting that the existence of unknown or unusually large bear populations demonstrates the need for more comprehensive conservation measures. The monster bear incident proves that we still don't fully understand the ecosystems we're supposed to be protecting, said Alaska Wilderness Alliance spokesperson Dr. Jennifer Walsh. It's a reminder that conservation efforts must account for the unknown as well as the documented. Scientists from universities around the world have requested permission to conduct research on Kodiak Island, hoping to document or disprove the existence of bear populations that exceed previously known size parameters. The University of Alaska has established a research station specifically dedicated to studying large predator populations throughout the state, with initial funding provided partly by insurance companies seeking to better understand and quantify risks associated with wildlife encounters. The rebuilt ferry terminal incorporates design features intended to prevent similar incidents, including reinforced pilings capable of withstanding much greater forces, emergency escape routes for dock workers, and improved lighting systems that eliminate shadowed areas where large predators might approach undetected. These modifications added nearly $50,000 to the reconstruction costs, but were deemed essential for ensuring the safety of maritime workers and ferry passengers. Local law enforcement agencies have revised their emergency response protocols to include procedures for dealing with unusually large or aggressive wildlife encounters. The Kodiak Police Department now maintains specialized equipment, including high-powered tranquilizer guns and emergency communication systems that can quickly summon assistance from state and federal wildlife management agencies. Brian Ortega's testimony has been incorporated into safety training programs used throughout Alaska's maritime industry, serving as a powerful reminder of the unpredictable dangers that can emerge from the state's wilderness areas. His detailed account of the attack has been analyzed by behavioral specialists, emergency response experts, and wildlife biologists, seeking to understand how such incidents might be prevented or managed more effectively in the future. Brian's experience teaches us that we can never become complacent about wildlife safety, especially in Alaska, where the wilderness is always close and the predators are always large and potentially dangerous, said Alaska Maritime Safety Foundation Director Captain Lisa Thompson. His survival was due partly to luck, partly to quick thinking, and partly to the rapid response of Coast Guard personnel who were able to reach him before the situation became even worse. The incident has also influenced boat design and equipment requirements for commercial fishing vessels operating in Alaska waters. New regulations require emergency beacons on all vessels, improved radio communication equipment, and emergency response protocols that include specific procedures for wildlife encounters. These changes, while adding to operating costs, are widely supported by the fishing industry as necessary measures for improving crew safety. Margaret Holt continues to live in Kodiak, maintaining the family home overlooking the bay where her husband spent his final moments. She has become an advocate for maritime safety improvements and frequently speaks to fishing industry groups about the importance of emergency preparedness and crew training. Sam would want his death to mean something, to help protect other fishermen from similar dangers, Margaret said during a recent speech to the Alaska Commercial Fishermen's Association. That's why I support all these new safety requirements, even though they're expensive and sometimes inconvenient. If they save even one life, then Sam's death will have served a purpose. The mystery of what exactly attacked the Sarah's Dream. That morning continues to generate speculation and debate among wildlife experts, though no definitive answers have emerged despite extensive research and investigation. The creature's apparent intelligence, unprecedented size, and unusual behavior patterns have led some researchers to propose theories ranging from unknown subspecies to genetic mutations caused by environmental factors unique to Kodiak Island. Dr. Marcus Webb, a geneticist at the University of Alaska Anchorage, has suggested that isolated bear populations on remote islands might develop characteristics significantly different from mainland populations due to unique evolutionary pressures and limited gene flow. Island gigantism is a well-documented phenomenon in many species, Dr. Webb explains. It's theoretically possible that Kodiak bears, already the largest brown bears in the world, could develop even more extreme size characteristics in isolated populations with abundant food sources and no natural predators. However, other experts remain skeptical of explanations that require the existence of bear populations so dramatically different from documented specimens. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, a bear behavior specialist at Montana State University, argues that the incident more likely involved a large but otherwise normal bear suffering from some form of neurological condition that altered its behavior patterns. While the size estimates are certainly impressive, they're not outside the realm of possibility for an exceptionally large Kodiak bear. Dr. Reynolds wrote in a peer-reviewed analysis of the incident, "The unusual behavior, the apparent stalking, the water attack, the sustained aggression could be explained by rabies, brain tumors, or other conditions that can cause dramatic changes in animal behavior." The debate continues within the scientific community, with new research projects launched regularly to investigate various aspects of the incident and its implications for understanding large predator populations in Alaska. These efforts have expanded knowledge of bear behavior and ecology throughout the state, even if they haven't provided definitive answers about what happened at the ferry terminal that August morning. Local residents have mixed feelings about the continued attention focused on their community as a result of the incident. Some welcome the economic benefits brought by increased tourism and research activities, while others feel that the focus on the monster bear has overshadowed the human tragedy of Sam Holt's death and the ongoing struggles faced by Brian Ortega and his family. "People come here looking for monsters and excitement," said longtime Kodiak resident Dorothy Chen, "but they forget that real people were hurt, that families were destroyed. Sam was a good man who died trying to protect his friend, and that's what people should remember about this whole thing." The anniversary of the attack is now marked by a memorial service for Sam Holt and a safety seminar for maritime workers, events that serve to honor the dead while educating the living about the ongoing risks associated with working in Alaska's challenging environment. These annual observances have become important community events that help residents process the trauma while recommitting themselves to safety and mutual support. As time passes, the immediate shock and fear generated by the incident have gradually given way to a more complex understanding of what happened and what it means for life in one of America's most remote and challenging communities. The rebuilt ferry terminal operates normally. Fishing boats come and go regularly, and life has largely returned to its pre-attack patterns. But on foggy mornings when visibility is limited and the forest falls unnaturally silent, those who work around the dock still find themselves listening carefully for sounds that shouldn't be there, still watching the tree line for movement that might indicate the presence of something large and dangerous. The memory of August 11th, 2024 serves as a permanent reminder that in Alaska's wilderness, the line between civilization and the unknown remains thin and easily crossed. The creature itself, whatever it was, has never been seen again, at least not in any encounter that resulted in official reports or credible documentation. But the legend grows stronger with each passing season, fed by occasional unexplained tracks, damaged equipment found in remote areas, and the persistent feeling among those who work these waters that something unprecedented continues to move through the shadows of Kodiak Island's vast wilderness, patient and intelligent and utterly without fear of the small, fragile humans who have claimed dominion over a world they still don't fully understand.